Hello, hello, hello.
All right, that looks right on my levels for levels. All right, so I'm going to go live.
Cool.
Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to Internet Law Review. We are here with the victim impact statements from Jeffrey Epstein's victims. So this happened yesterday in district court in New York, and we're going to cover this in full because I think it's important. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host for the evening, Tactical Bra, as I'm sure you all know her. She is a
Yay.
paralegal and assistant to my good friend and yours, Leonard French. But she also has some subject matter expertise, so I'll let her introduce herself so that she can tell you a little bit about what she has generally to know about the subject matter.
So my undergrad was psychology with a minor in sexuality studies, and non-consensual, so sex trafficking or sexual assault was part of the education that I received. I've also worked with local groups that provided support for women who had experienced sexual assault, not as one of the counselors, but I provided support to the counselors. So it was like a little bit of one step removed, but it was during my undergrad, it was something that I was very aware of, and I have a lot of experience with people who work in the field of helping victims. So, and of course, I have some forensic psych background as well. So I know particularly about sexual offenders against children.
Very, very cool. So, just by way of brief legal background, I thought we'd go over a little bit about victims' rights in general before we get into the specific subject matter. So there is a federal law on point. It is 18 USC section 3771, which is currently not displaying on my screen properly, making me look very good. But put myself on camera. But what it basically gives is any victim of crimes in federal law gives them a right to opportunity to be notified of proceedings, gives them an opportunity to participate in hearings, gives them an opportunity to participate as part of the plea discussions and any sentencing. And this is typically most manifested at the end of a trial as part of the sentencing procedure. There's usually an opportunity in federal cases for the victim to come forward and give a brief statement as to their thoughts on the subject one way or another. It's an opportunity for them to put forward a statement if they haven't already and to say how they've been impacted. And of course, it could influence the judge one way or another, depending on the nature of what they have to say. You know, sometimes people want to show mercy for a whole bunch of reasons, even if they've been personally impacted. And so, it can obviously have impacts either way. But this is something that's been relatively recent in federal law. This is only coming about. It only came about 2004, as a matter of fact, in its first iteration. And it's been amended a couple times since then. So this has only been something that's been going on for 15 years to give victims the sort of formalized opportunity to participate and engage in this. So, yeah. So we're just going to read this, including all the court preliminary stuff. And Tactical, if you want to interject at any time, if you have something that you want to, highlight or comment on, feel free to interject.
Just to
If there's
interrupt
something in
you.
particular you want to read, that's fine.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So there's some preliminary stuff, and we are going to read the preliminary stuff just so you can give get an idea of how this, actually happened in the real world. The court begins by saying, "Good morning, everybody. Please be seated." So just some housekeeping. We have a podium here for both attorneys and others who may be speaking, and so we would like you, attorneys and others who are speaking, to come up to the podium. The room is a little cavernous. We thought the podium over there would be more comfortable. For starters, and for this, you don't have to go up to the podium. If you could just indicate your names. This table in front, to my left, to your right, are defense counsel. On the table to my right, your left, are the government's attorneys. If we could just ask the attorneys to introduce themselves. Good morning, Your Honor. Maureen Comey and Allison Moe for the government. Joining us at counsel table are Special Agent Amanda Young of the FBI and Detective Paul Byrne of the NYPD. Good morning, Your Honor. Reed Whiteberg says, Martin Whiteberg, good morning, Your Honor. Michael Miller from Steptoe Johnson on behalf of the defendant. Court says great. Again, good morning to all of you. This hearing we have today considers the government's motions to dismiss the indictment in this case. Obviously, since Jeffrey Epstein is dead, there is no more case. So we're here on a motion to dismiss, but the court has decided to extend an opportunity to be heard, and so I think that's really great. The court continues by saying, "I must add that it also serves as an opportunity for me to thank all of you, the attorneys and the victims who are here today, among others, for your very hard work and dedication in the case. We also have here today the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Jeffrey Berman, who also has been very helpful and indispensable in this matter. The news on August 10th, 2019, that Jeffrey Epstein had been found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the MCC, was certainly shocking. Most of you, and myself for that matter, were anticipating that the next steps in this case would be the defense motion practice, including a motion to dismiss, following a trial on the merits before a jury if the motions were not successful, and through which the accusers and the accused would come face to face, allowing everyone to get their day in court. Mr. Epstein's death obviously means that the trial for which he is a defendant cannot take place. It is a rather stunning turn of events. But of course, this is only limited to criminal context. The civil trials will, of course, continue, but in criminal cases, you have a right to confront your accusers, you have a right to assist counsel, and obviously that's not possible if you're deceased. So the criminal case, unfortunately, cannot continue, not for at least the reasons that you can't punish someone after they're already dead. The government's motion to dismiss the indictment because of Jeffrey Epstein's death on August 10th, 2019 is relatively straightforward. In my view, a public hearing clearly is nevertheless the preferred vehicle for this resolution. Incidentally, while I'm on this subject, I got some help today from the New York Law Journal from two professors who write that a hearing is, let me tell you exactly what they said. They said in part that this is an odd moment for transparency in a criminal case. I think that's an odd sentence to hear about transparency in a criminal case. They go on to say normally if a prosecutor seeks to dismiss an indictment for such an obviously worthy reason, the court would simply grant the request. As to that statement, I respectfully say that's incorrect as a matter of law. Well, okay. They go on to say the judge would not schedule a hearing and definitely would not allow the victims to speak. If he did hold a hearing, whatever informational interest the victims may have will be served by affording them a chance to attend the hearing, not by giving them a speaking role. I read it. It was incredulous. I'm still incredulous. I don't quite understand it at all. There's a suggestion in the article that the reason they are making these suggestions has to do with the minimization of drama in this case. In the Jeffrey Epstein case, there has not been much minimization of drama, and what little drama might happen today, I think, won't be very significant. On a somewhat more serious note, don't quote me on this, but it's my understanding that one of the authors of the article himself is counsel in one of the Epstein-related cases. I was surprised to learn of that very recently. I'm certain it is true. I'm also surprised that that aspect was not disclosed to the Law Journal. But in any event, I think you know where I'm heading. I respectfully disagree with the Law Journal's piece. I was saying the government motion is relatively straightforward, and in my view, a public hearing is clearly, nevertheless, the preferred vehicle for its resolution. I'm still convinced of that. A few may differ on this, but public hearings are exactly what judges do. Hearings promote transparency, and they provide the court with insights and information which with the court may not otherwise be aware. The victims have been included in the proceeding today both because of their relevant experiences and because they should always be involved before rather than after the fact. Indictment 19 CR 490 charges Jeffrey Epstein with sex trafficking and with conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The United States Attorney on August 19, 2019, requested the court approve the government's proposed order of nolle prosecuale, which just means to not go forward, and everyone says no null pros, so I'll be pronouncing it for the rest of this time as null pros. I think that's rough justice. That means that null pros continued by the prosecutor of all or part of the case that he or she has commenced. The government in its motion concludes that Epstein's death abates this proceedings. In accordance with the Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 57B, I've determined to hold a public hearing and notify the victims that they be given the opportunity to be heard before any final action on the motion. That is also the purpose of today's proceedings. I would do that every time. Also recognize that Mr. Epstein, died before any judgment of the conviction against him had been obtained, and the government's proposed order appears in form and substance to be appropriate. Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 48A codifies the null pros process. It is an entitled dismissal, and it states in relevant part the government may, with leave of the court, dismiss an indictment, information, or complaint, and the leave of the court proviso, you should know, was added as an amendment to the original draft of Rule 48, which had originally provided for automatic dismissal upon a motion of the government. This proviso, in my judgment, is clearly directed towards the independent judicial assessment of the public interest in dismissing the indictment. Thus, even whereas in this case the standard of the court review is deferential, the court must still make its own independent determination. A conclusory statement from the government that dismissal is appropriate does not always satisfy the court's obligations. It is also, in my view, required that the court consider the views of the victims in the case at the hearing and before deciding whether to grant the motion. This is being done both here as a matter of law and a measure of respect that we have for the victim's difficult decision to come forward in the matter. In a case called United States v. Heaton, the government filed a Rule 48 motion to dismiss a charge against a defendant who had allegedly committed a sexual offense against a younger victim. Although I should point out very importantly that the defendant was still alive, which distinguishes it from this case. Nevertheless, I think that's irrelevant because in evaluating the Rule 48 motion, then District Judge Paul G. Counsel, who is now a law professor at the University of Utah and is regarded as a noted expert in victims' rights, concluded that under the Victims' Rights Act, victims have broad rights to extend the court's decision as to whether or not to grant the government motion to dismiss under Rule 48. I also completely share the viewpoint that in these circumstances, even through the facts of the cases I've said, are somewhat difficult from those in Heaton. I believe it is the court's responsibility and manifestly within its purview to ensure the victims in this case are treated fairly and with dignity. The fundamental substance procedure which applies in considering the government's motion is termed the rule of abatement. This principle originated in the English common law. It was adopted in most U.S. federal courts, but more recently it has faced some appropriate criticism. The rule of abatement is best explained in the Second Circuit case of United States v. Wright. In the Wright case, two defendants had pleaded guilty to embezzlement and tax evasion. Both defendants appealed, but one of the defendants died while his appeal was pending in the Second Circuit. The Court of Appeals ruled that under the rule of abatement, the judgment of conviction against the deceased defendant was required to be vacated and the indictment was to be dismissed. The Wright court held that when a convicted defendant dies while his direct appeal as a matter of right is pending, his death abates not only the appeal, but also the proceedings during the court of the prosecution. The Second Circuit incidentally held that when a criminal conviction abates upon the death of a defendant, any restitution ordered as a result of the conviction must also abate, and is also ruled the same respect to associate forfeiture orders. This latter application of the rule of abatement regarding forfeiture has not been universally accepted among the federal courts, but it is certainly the law in this circuit. Some of you may be interested to know that some United States state courts have criticized the rule of abatement, particularly in the face of growing recognition of victims' rights in the criminal justice system, including the Criminal Victims' Rights Act. It has been written and contended in the Brooklyn Law Review, I can give you the site later, that when courts abate criminal convictions, they reimpose a burden on victims that the legislatures intend to alleviate through the victims' rights statutes. The state Supreme Court has even concluded that the expansion and codification of victims' rights provides the changed conditions needed for overruling the rule of abatement. It has also been stated that the Alaska statute and its constitution now requires the criminal justice system to accommodate the rights of crime victims. Further, the abatement of criminal convictions has important implications for these rights. But coming back to this case, while what you're concerned about, and I am as well, is appropriately to conclude that if the rule abatement applies to a convicted defendant, as in the Wright case, it should also apply a fortiori in the Esptein case, which was still in the pretrial phase when Mr. Epstein died, when there has been no conviction. So that's just some background I want to share with you. At this point in time, I'd like to turn to the government prosecutors to hear from them in support of their Rule 48 application to dismiss the Epstein indictment. So in case some of those details were unclear when I was reading the transcript, basically there is currently a rule that says that if you are, even if you're convicted, as long as your direct appeal, your appeal to the Court of Appeals is still ongoing, then if you die, then that criminal conviction is wiped off the books. The rationale being that if you have an appeal as a matter of right, then because you died while it was ongoing, that can't be fully adjudicated because you can't assist your counsel and so forth and so on. So even though you were convicted by a jury and found to be guilty, if you die while the appeal is ongoing, they wipe out the guilty verdict as though it didn't happen. And as the judge is saying here, this has been criticized by some of the courts for the reasons that they illuminated, because it takes away, a victory that these people might very well be entitled to. And, an appeal as a matter of right is not quite the same thing as saying that the person is, when they've already been adjudicated, should be found not guilty.
Yeah, I find this a little bit weird because, so if I was a victim and part of the punishment of the defendant, of the person who was convicted, is to pay me restitution for some of the damage, which can happen in criminal cases. We usually think of that for civil, but it can happen in criminal as well. To have the conviction erased when the person dies, it's like, well, that estate, as a victim, I would think that the estate still owes me, right? That there's some sort of criminal forfeiture that I would expect to happen. But if they die during an appeal, like, does that forfeiture just go away?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what they're talking about. Now, we should be, in terms of criminal law forfeiture, most forfeitures go to the government. Now, there are provisions in the law that talk about crime victims being compensated as part of a criminal proceeding, but it's a little bit different than a forfeiture. But in either case, yes, they're all wiped off the books. So the guilty verdict is wiped off, the forfeiture is wiped off, any sort of entitlement that would be due to the crime victim, that would, particularly in like sex abuse cases where there's mandatory compensation. Child pornography cases is another example. So as long as the appeal is ongoing, all that stuff is erased, at least in the Second Circuit, where New York is. So yeah, that's the law as a matter of today. Of course, that doesn't prevent you from having a civil remedy. So you can still go and sue them privately as a matter of suing their estate, but all those sanctions from the criminal law go away.
What I'm wondering is when journalists write about things, so if someone has been convicted, they're allowed to say this person is a thief, is a liar, is whatever, because a court of law has found those facts to be true. So the reporters can call you a murderer if you've been convicted of murder. If you haven't been convicted, they have to say alleged. If the person dies, do you still get to call them a murderer if their conviction has kind of been abated?
Well, it's not that they have to say, at least in the United States, they don't have to say alleged. It's just as a matter of CYA covering their butt, because, on the off chance that, it all falls apart, they don't want the liability. It's also kind of just a matter of how people write. But to answer your question, I mean, I mean they can obviously take note of the fact they were convicted. The fact they were convicted is not is a truthful statement. So you can say, well, they're convicted by the jury. And so at least for me, if I were the legal advisor for a newspaper, I'd feel perfectly comfortable in saying they don't have to say alleged anymore. That's where I would stand. All right. So let us continue reading, and we are back here with the government in support of their motion. Thank you, Your Honor. Would you like me to address the court from the podium, if you wouldn't mind? Thank you, Your Honor. I believe Your Honor has accurately summarized the state of the law as set forth in our papers. In light of clear Second Circuit law that upon the death of the defendant before final entry of judgment, all proceedings must be abated. In light of the clear law, the government is legally obligated to seek dismissal of the pending indictment against Jeffrey Epstein, and we respectfully submit likewise the entry of the proposed order is simply required by law. A few notes to make about that, though, Your Honor. To be very clear, dismissal of this indictment as to Jeffrey Epstein in no way prohibits or inhibits the government's ongoing investigation into other potential co-conspirators, nor does it prevent bringing a new case in the future of a prosecution of new defendants. It also does nothing to prevent the government from continuing to explore the possibility of seeking civil forfeiture of any assets that were used to facilitate the crimes charged in the indictment. Indeed, as we've stated publicly, investigations into those matters have been ongoing, remain ongoing, and will continue following the dismissal of the indictment here. So perhaps this is maybe one of the very, very few circumstances in which I would say criminal asset forfeiture might be an okay thing. Normally, as a matter of principle, I tend to oppose it. But yeah, maybe it's okay here. This is the kind of case that makes you reconsider your convictions, right? I'd also like to know that, as the government has previously mentioned, this dismissal in no way lessens the government's resolve to stand up for the victims in this case, both those who have come forward and those who have yet to do so. We agree with Your Honor's sentiment that those victims should be respected, and we appreciate Your Honor's recognition of that. One housekeeping matter I did want to reference for Your Honor. The protective order in this case requires the destruction or return of any or all discovery material upon conclusion of the case. We've been in communication with defense counsel, have confirmed that they have returned all physical copies they have of the discovery the government has produced to date, and they're in the process of deleting any copies they may have made. So the parties are in compliance with the protective order. So as part of, obviously, the ability to give the defense the ability to have, they have to give the defense everything. So they, all those pictures they, for example, found in Jeffrey Epstein's house, the child pornography photos, they have to give to the defense so they have an opportunity to review it. Anything else they have. But there was a protective order that basically requires this material to be held confidentially, and when the case is over, to it to be returned or otherwise destroyed for very obvious prudential reasons. So that's what they're talking about there. Finally, I just want to say a word about the victims in this case, and particularly those who are here in court today. I'll make note that in light of the court's order indicating the victims and their counsel would be permitted to hear in court today, the government has endeavored to provide notice to all the known victims of today's proceeding. We did so either directly when a victim was not represented by counsel, or through a counsel when a victim is represented through an attorney. The government does not know exactly how many victims or their attorneys are here today, and we do not know how many of them or their counsel intend to speak. To the extent any individuals do wish to speak, we do not know the substance of what they'd like to say. We've left that up entirely to the individual decisions of the victims and their attorneys. I will note, however, that throughout the case, the government has endeavored and done our utmost to fulfill our obligations under the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Incidentally, not for the least of reasons, that in the prior case involving Mr. Epstein, Mr. Acosta, who was then the U.S. attorney at the time, did not perhaps comply with the full letter and spirit of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, and so I imagine that the Crime Victims' Rights Act is being done extra super diligently here for exactly that reason. Continuing on, we've done so by trying to keep up as many victims as we're aware of to date about the ongoing case and any developments in the case. We will continue to provide services and offer services to any victim in this case, even after the indictment is dismissed. Both the United States Attorney and the FBI have been in touch with all known victims or have attempted to be in touch with all known victims, either again directly when the victims are not represented by counsel or through counsel when they have attorneys. We have expressed to them the services that are available for those who wish to take advantage of them. Unless the court has any questions for me, the government will otherwise rest on its papers. The court, I have just one question. The protective order, is that self-executing or do I need to do something? Mr. Comey, it's self-executing, Your Honor. The court, thank you very much, Ms. Comey. Ms. Comey, thank you very much. The court, yes. I'll turn to counsel for the defense at this time. Mr. Weingarten, I'll hear from you. Mr. Weingarten, thank you. Your Honor, I think it's an understatement of the year to say the world looks and feels differently today than it did the last time I was before you. For us, the elephant in the room is what happened to our client. I'd like to tell you how we see the world and where we are on the subject. We start with the Attorney General's statements, public statements, that there were very serious improprieties in the jail. We obviously read the press. We see that the warden has been taken out. We see the guards on the time have been put on leave. We understand guards are refusing to cooperate with the investigation. We've heard allegations that people at the time who had responsibility for protecting our client falsified information. And here they're talking about the time logs in particular, where the guards said that they visited every half hour when in fact they did not. At a minimum. They continue. We understand that there are orders out there that Jeffrey Epstein was never to be left alone, and these orders were ignored by many of the employees of the prison. In a word, yikes. In addition, obviously, we follow the medical examiner's report, or we haven't followed the report. We haven't seen it yet, but we heard conclusions initially. Not enough evidence to come to a conclusion. Wanted to see more. We assumed she was talking about videotapes, but then they came to the conclusion that was suicide. We report to the court, suicide by hanging. Mr. Weingarten, yes. The court, was her conclusion? Mr. Weingarten, yes. I report to the court that the doctor there at the time, who had also been in receipt of tremendous amount of medical and scientific evidence, volunteered to us, opining that the injuries suffered, as reported, were far more consistent with assault than with suicide. And we're happy to supply the court with all the information we have. Now, in addition, as the court noted, we were underway with our pre-trial motions, and as the court obviously understands, the NPA and the role of the NPA was going to be critically important. I'd simply like to report that went pretty far along. We interviewed all the relevant lawyers on the defense side who participated in the NPA. We're satisfied that we had a very strong argument that every one of those lawyers believed with an objective basis that the deal was global. The NPA here is referring to the non-prosecution agreement that was signed in the prior deal with Esptein. Okay, so just wow, that's a whole nother subject that we could spend a lot of time on. But long story short, the way it was drafted could be read in such a way as to insulate Mr. Epstein from all crimes, is what they mean by global. All crimes everywhere. And the reason that's unusual is because every single one of these agreements I've ever read, ever, except for the one involving Mr. Epstein, say specifically, repeatedly, that it only applies to crimes that happen in the particular judicial district at notice. But this agreement, for reasons passing all understanding, was written in such a way as to possibly apply to all federal crimes everywhere, which is so off the chains, insanely unusual. I can't even think of another time it's happened. So that's what they're talking about when they say about whether it's global or not. This non-prosecution agreement would be for all crimes everywhere, including potentially the ones that are at bar in this particular case. So they're arguing that the MPA precludes this entire trial that they're talking about at this time from occurring. That's how bizarre this is. It's wacko land. Anyways, continuing on. Although, of course, for the record, I do not fault Mr. Epstein's attorneys for making arguments vigorously in favor of their client. My scorn is more directed at Mr. Costa and his very, very sloppy NPA. Anyways, continuing on.
You obviously have a lot more experience than me, but when I was researching the Backpage deals in which basically the people that ran the website Backpage, which started off as a classified ad site and quickly became like Prostitute Central or Sex Worker Central, and they were they were all charged by the FBI for facilitating prostitution and sex trafficking because basically they put in effort to approve the ads, And so because they previewed the ads and then they made a decision of whether to have the ads or not, then they were knowledgeable, and so they weren't protected under CDA Section 230, the Communications Decency Act, because it wasn't like somebody flags an ad and then they go, oh, that ad shouldn't be there, and then they deleted it. You had to submit your ad. The ad was viewed by a person and then approved or unapproved. And so they weren't under Section 230 safe harbor, and they got nailed for facilitating prostitution. And I read their plea agreements, and their the deals basically saying, okay, well, we won't prosecute you for all of these other crimes if you plead guilty to this crime or that crime. But it has a lot of details in terms of like this is a deal with the state, or sorry, this is a deal with the feds, with the FBI. You're not covered when it comes to state stuff. Like the states, they're sovereign. They get to decide whether they want to charge you or not. And you have to know that, which becomes really difficult as someone who is, the accused, that because it's an internet service, you can get charged basically by any state that the ads were relevant to, and you can get charged by the federal government. And any state that you did like banking in, you could get charged. So really what you need to do is work out like 53 plea agreements or like 52.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and that's the complication. Now, I don't know how the back page plea was written in terms of the feds, but usually when they're written in the federal government, they usually say, like, this is the Southern District of New York, so we'll just use it as an example. If they were going to write a plea agreement, it would say something like, this is only binding. It would say in the plea agreement, it's only binding to the Southern District of New York. It doesn't bind any other district. And I think there are 104 federal districts, if memory serves correctly. So basically, the deal is that at the U.S. prosecutor, and there's one for each district, the boss of each district, they can only bind their district because it's their district. So they will write an agreement saying, like, okay, I'm giving you immunity or giving you a deal as to anything that's under my control. And so these deals are always, and every time I've ever written them, always written so it says, this is only binding the Southern District of New York, only bind the district of whatever. And so what makes this non-prosecution agreement special is that all that language that normally would say this only binds the Eastern District of Florida was not there. And so they're saying, well, this agreement binds all 104 federal prosecutors' offices, which is not the deal. Normally, that is not how this works. But that's the argument. It's not even like if the state of New York can have a case. It's like, did Mr. Acosta, when he made a deal in Florida, bind the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York? That's the argument. And the very fact we're having this discussion is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs insane, because that just does not happen. I mean, it's just not a thing that should occur. So it's a whole other world of special. And it's one of the many, many things that, in this commentator's opinions, makes everything just so suspicious. Because it's like, Mr. Acosta is not that stupid. And even if he was, he had an office full of people who are not that stupid. So it's hard to imagine that it was just pure sloppy. And the entire deal was so charitable to Epstein. So it's like, it just makes every conspiracy muscle in your brain go off. Because it's like, nothing makes any sense. There's no way that this should be happening. And then you see like all the coincidences that would have to occur for this just to be a suicide. Like, oh, the guards weren't really paying attention and they were told not to leave him alone, but they did when he was on suicide watch and not. It's like the whole thing just makes all the muscles in my brain go crazy. But let's carry on with the defense and what they want to say about how their client is totally immune from the Southern District of New York, even if he were still alive. Mr. Weingarten, the deal of the non-prosecution agreement was global. More specifically, at the time, the Florida prosecutors and agents knew of conduct in New York, and no competent defense counsel negotiating in good faith with prosecutors would have ever agreed to a deal back then that would allow New York prosecutors to indict for precisely the same conduct in the future, which of course is what happened. In addition, we have come up with very powerful evidence. We believe that Florida prosecutors who participated in the deal steered the victims and the alleged victims to New York on more than one occasion because they did not want to suffer the slights of attacks against them. So we have advanced the ball on this very subject, and we're prepared to complete the report as to where we are and what we've done. Another point, we obviously had contact with our client at or around the time of his death. Not for the least of reasons that his will apparently was written 2 days before he died, but that's also not in any way suspicious, I'm sure. And obviously, the attorney-client privilege survives death, and we're not going to forfeit the privilege, but we are going to report to the court with as much specificity as the court may want that at or around the time of his death, we did not see a despairing, despondent, suicidal person. Details to follow if the court wishes.
Can I just interrupt for a second?
You may.
Because I also have extensive background in suicide interventions. That is actually not uncommon for someone to appear happier or relieved or more like their old self in the days before they commit suicide or they attempt. And this is because they've already made up in their mind. They already know that there's an end in sight. And so they're getting their last things together. So one of the signs that someone is contemplating suicide is they start giving their things away. They're happier than they've been in a long time, and they start giving you stuff. Or they start saying that they're sorry for things. It's like they're making amends. They're tying up the loose ends. They're preparing to go, and just the knowledge, like, okay, I only have to live for 2 more days, is such a relief for them that they can appear in high spirits. So that's not actually super uncommon. In terms of did the attorneys act in an ethical way? They're obviously saying we didn't see any warning signs that he had already determined that he was going to do this. And like, I don't blame them. It's not radically bizarre for someone to be in good spirits a few days before they kill themselves.
No, that's a very, very solid point, and I appreciate you bringing it to our attention. Because, now that you say it, I am familiar with having heard that, but since it's not something I study, all the time, it wouldn't have occurred to me to mention it. So I really appreciate you bringing that to our attention. So yeah, maybe that's that's evidence the other way. Maybe the fact that he was writing a will 2 days before, and he seemed in upbeat spirits, maybe that is more suggestive of suicide, and we should factor that into the analysis. So tactical Bob brings us back down from the conspiracy and brings us back into the realm of, okay, maybe this is more plausible after all. So, hey, I'll take any facts I can get. I want to make the best reasoned decisions I can. So I appreciate you bringing it to our attention. The 800-pound gorilla for us, of course, are the video surveillance tapes, which this happened yesterday, and I now understand those tapes are unusable, but they didn't know this at the time. Obviously, we assume there's a tape that leads directly to the door where Jeffrey Epstein was housed. If the tape reports for 12 hours before his death that no one went in and out of the room, then the suggestion that there was something other than suicide seems preposterous. Yes, if there was a tape that was pointed at his door and no one went in or out, then the fact that it would be a murder would seem to be much harder. But the fact that tapes are unusable just seems like, wow, what are the odds in this parade of errors? So again, back into the conspiracy. Carrying on. But there's no such evidence that has surfaced to date, just the opposite. We have heard, and we've actually read the tape, that the tapes were either corrupted or not functioning. Talk about a yikes. They like that word. If in fact the system was broken for 6 months before Jeffrey Epstein was housed, that would be stunning incompetence. If it was allowed to continue to be inoperative when Jeffrey Epstein was housed, that'd be incompetence times 10. But what if the tapes only broke down or were inoperative or corrupted on the day he was killed or the day he died? Then we're in a completely different situation. So where does that lead? I think where that leads, Judge, is that there are incredibly important questions that remain open. The public interest in this matter is obvious from the courtroom. There are conspiracy theories galore. Yes, your favorite patent attorney is not above it because at this point it's so weird that, yeah. We are all for finding the truth. We believe this court has an indispensable role to play. Whether or not this indictment is dismissed, I think this court has an inherent authority to find out what happened on its watch. Probably does. Obviously, when this court detained Jeffrey Epstein, the court did not anticipate that a week later he'd be dead in his cell. I think given the inherent authority of the court should make an inquiry. This could come in many forms. Obviously, the court made inquiries to what happened in the first instance, his first attempt. When there was an allegation of an attempted suicide, the court made an inquiry. The court was obviously interested. I recall your language. You talked about being one of the several open questions, indicating an interest on the court for others as well. Obviously, the ultimate question is what happened to the client. You're talking about the July 23rd, 2019 incident. Yes. The court obviously could hold hearings. The court could assign a lawyer to help the court. I think this is the area where there's intense public interest. We have complete confidence in the prosecutors of the Southern District and the FBI to do a complete investigation. But their allegations against serious components of the United States Department of Justice. Sometimes the appearance of justice is just as important as justice itself. That's very true. It is very important that justice not only be done, but seen to be done. I think that the court supervising or at least keeping an interest in the proceeding is incredibly important for the public to have confidence in the ultimate findings, and certainly for us to have confidence in the ultimate findings. One more issue, Judge. The conditions of the jail, in a word, they were dreadful. Not just for Jeffrey Epstein, but for many of the prisoners over there. This is a prison within the shadows of this courthouse. The situation is rife with vermin. I have heard tell that there are some big rats going through that prison, yes. The abuse and conditions in that prison, as a word, are a disgrace, and everyone knows this. A person with authority told us, someone in knowledge, that the prisoners in Guantanamo, and he spoke with personal knowledge, are treated better than the prisoners right across the way. The feds certainly know how to run a disciplined, clean prison. I've been in 20 of them, presumably as an attorney, not as a client. They know how to do just fine. And the question is, why in the world does it not happen just down the road? I think that's a perfectly legitimate subject for the court to make an inquiry. In the world, we want the court to help find us out what happened. The court has a role to play. It is the institution that most people have confidence in these very troubled times. So whether or not you dismiss the indictment to us is besides the point. We wish to stay at the case, conduct the investigation. We want to know what happened here. Thank you, Your Honor. The court. Just so it's clear, so your view on the motion as to the merits of the null pros order and the application, do you have a view as to that? Mr. Weingart, I think the court felt that the case had to stay alive for the court to continue. We would oppose it. I think the court, what? Mr. Weingart, if you took the position that for you to conduct the investigation or to lead the investigation or participate in the investigation, then we'd want the role for you to play. If the indictment has to be alive, we would oppose the motion. Yeah, they want the indictment to stay alive if the court needs it to stay jurisdiction, which honestly at this point, I don't necessarily oppose, but I don't know procedurally enough to know whether that's good or not. Anyways, carrying on. I don't think you need to do that. I think you can dismiss the indictment. So you're suggesting that we support the government's motion just viewed in the context of Mr. Weingarten. Yes, of course. The court. Great. Mr. Weingarten, Judge, if I can just supplement. The court. Absolutely. Mr. Weingarten, thank you, sir. Just incidentally, we're all seeing good examples of trial practice, how to talk to the court. Love, sir. May I? This is all very good. Mr. Weingarten, thank you, sir. Thank you. As an out-of-town lawyer for the privilege to appear before the court, Your Honor. Oh, Lord. That's a little much. Your Honor, the court, it's my pleasure. Mr. Weingarten, first as the conditions, we think Your Honor trusted the government, the Bureau of Prisons, to keep our client safe and keep him in civilized conditions. The government will ask, as to other defendants, that they be detained at the MCC. Some subset of them will end up in the secured housing unit. It is horrific. It's been called medieval. There are vermin on the floor. It is wet from the plumbing. There is no sunlight. There is limited exercise. It's simply conditions that no pretrial detainee, and I go farther as a criminal defense lawyer, no United States defendant should be subject to. Certain judges have taken the view of conditions. We would urge, Your Honor, the government talk about transparency to see what kind of conditions there exist within 50 or 100 yards of one of the greatest United States district courts. Second, in terms, we have a profound problem with the conclusions of the medical examiner. There are 3 reasons, Your Honor. One is the timing of Mr. Epstein's demise. It was on August the 10th. On August the 12th, a bail motion was being filed before the Second Circuit. On the 12th or 13th, the United States attorneys were going to respond to our request for the preservation and production of documents that would have facilitated and furthered our efforts to demonstrate communications between the Southern District of Florida, the Northern District of Georgia, which is standing in the shoes of the Southern District of Florida main justice, and the Southern District of New York. In other words, we're beginning the process of discharging our responsibilities. There had been no new evidence that Mr. Epstein had committed any offense against a minor after 2005. I feel super reassured right now, let me tell you. The subject matter of the New York prosecution was squarely within the heartline of the Florida non-prosecution agreement. We have significant we have a significant motion to dismiss. This was not futile, defeatist attitude. Third, we had all discovery motions that Your Honor had scheduled. So for the timing of a pretrial detainee to commit suicide on August the 10th, when a bail appeal motion was being filed on the 12th, strikes us as implausible. Second, we had an independent doctor who was present at the autopsy, which occurred on the 11th. On August the 11th, the city medical examiner's findings were inconclusive. We are told that a very experienced forensic pathologist that a broken bone in Mr. Epstein's neck, his larynx, are more consistent with external pressure, with strangulation, with homicide, if you will, than suicide. It doesn't exclude suicide, but the pure medical forensic evidence creates profound issues about what happened to him. Also at the time of his death, our medical examiner's opinion, it occurred at least 45 minutes and probably hours before the 6:30 a.m. on the 10th when he was first found, if you will, according to the reports. Yet he was moved, something that's not ordinary in the circumstances, I would assume. The court. Excuse me? He was moved? Mr. Weinberg, instead of having the cell in the condition it was found, if he had been dead for 45 minutes or 2 hours or 4 hours, there were efforts to move him, and therefore made difficult to reconstruct whether or not he had died or suicide or some other cause. So they're saying that he was moved after he was found dead before the medical examiner got to him. That is a no-no for every
Yeah,
possible reason.
that's very much a no-no. And I happen to be like an avid enthusiast about like autopsies and causes of death and how they can like figure stuff out because I find it like a fascinating puzzle. And so when they're referring to the bone in the larynx, they're referring to the hyoid bone, which is a very small, fragile bone. And when people get strangled, the thumb is often, directly on that bone. And so if the hyoid is broken, that's often a sign of strangulation. However, if you've hanged yourself, it is possible for the hyoid to break, but it's less common. So it doesn't actually substantiate one story or the other to have that broken bone. However, they would definitely be able to tell if the body had been moved because when your heart stops pumping, the blood pools in the direction of gravity.
Right.
And so there will be sort of bruising and marks and such on the body where the blood is pooled. So if they moved him, then you would be able to tell, well, okay, if he was on his back, but the blood pooled as if he was on his side, he's been moved. So that it's possible though that when the guards came in, that they tried to perform CPR or any sort of life-saving things, and so that could involve moving the body because you would want the body on the back so that you could do proper CPR. However, if he had been dead for a while, he might have even been cold to the touch. So it's kind of, it doesn't really point one way or the other. Like we haven't ruled out foul play, but we haven't
Oh no, I agree
had a
100%.
very direct. We don't have a smoking gun.
No, I 100% agree with you. I mean, all the evidence that we have is inferential, and we obviously apparently the defense doesn't even have a copy of an autopsy report. All we have is the finding. So they apparently don't even have a copy of the report, which would presumably include all these details, which would be helpful. So I don't know whether or not we'll ever get that or not. If we do, I guarantee you I'm going to cover it because I want to know something. And I'd also be interested to know if their lawyers, now that they had the body, his brother, I think, picked it up, but maybe they had another autopsy independently done for all I know. Who knows? Anyways, I don't know how you go about officially challenging the city coroners in New York. I assume there must be some procedure where you can go and like officially challenge a finding. So maybe they'll go do that too. This could get interesting for many reasons.
Yes, and I think the way that you read it, to me, it sounded like they had an independent doctor sort of observe and supervise the
They did.
autopsy so that the second doctor would be able to say if there was something out of place or if, incorrect inferences were drawn. So the doctor being able to observe the autopsy and double check that everything is being done correctly, I think was a very prudent thing, especially in such a controversial case.
Yeah. Yeah, they did have an independent doctor who observed, as I remember, who may have had some experience from JFK assassination or some other high profile stuff too. But anyways, yeah, they definitely had an independent doctor present. Mr. Weinberg continues. I spoke to Stacy Richmond, who is a responsible member of this court, who represents the family of Mr. Epstein. She spoke to the medical examiner on Friday after Mr. Epstein's death and asked why, if conclusions were made late in the afternoon of Friday that week. I think it's because Friday is what we collectively and lovingly call take out the trash day. It's when you dump stories you don't want anyone to cover. But let's see what they said. She specifically asked about whether extrinsic non-medical evidence caused the medical examiner to go from uncertain to suicide. She says she was told by the medical examiner see 9 minutes of one video that was on the stairwell between the floors at the MCC. She's told the principal video that would have shown the whole hall was corrupted. It was the DC with the FBI to see if they could reconstruct it. I asked the same questions my co-counsel did. Was it a function of the critical pivotal video in the most secure prison east of Florence? Florence would be the Supermax facility in Colorado, the different place you do not want to go. The most secure prison east of Florence, out of Colorado, known to the MCC before August 10th, or was this corruption occurring on August 10th, which would again cause us to be skeptical of the certitude of medical examiner's conclusion that this was suicide rather than some other cause. So with my co-counsel, we asked Your Honor, it's not a question of trust or not trust. They asked to detain people, and you trust the Bureau of Prisons. And it's within your inherent authority, Your Honor, to find out what happened to our client. We're angry about the conditions he was held in. We're also angry, quite frankly, Your Honor, that the only source of information that we get as to what happened to him is through the media and through the United States Attorney's Office. We've made requests informally. We've made totally requests, and I don't know what that is. We might have to look it up. We've been told there's a pending investigation. We trust Your Honor and the judiciary, and with all due respect, we believe there's an inherent and pivotal role in Your Honor to find out what happened to the defendant in a case before the court, whether or not the court grants the null pros today, or whether it holds the pending investigation into Mr. Epstein's death. We're not here without significant doubts regarding the conclusion of suicide. We're not here to say what happened. We don't know what happened, but we deeply want to know what happened to our client. Thank you, sir. And you, as Mr. Epstein, have the same view of the null pros motion. Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Your Honor, may I respond to some of those points? Sure. Thank you, Your Honor. Just briefly. With the exception of noting that the defense does not have an objection to the government's motion, virtually everything else defense counsel just argued respectfully is completely irrelevant to the purposes of today's proceedings. The motion that's before us, before Your Honor. As an initial matter, the court, well, it may be. Well, I don't know. You say irrelevant. It's a public hearing. I think it's fair game for defense counsel to raise concerns. Mr. Comey, certainly, Your Honor. See, that is good trial practice. He just said, this is completely irrelevant. And the court said, I'm not so sure. And so what does he do? He says, you're completely right, Your Honor. That's good trial practice. I also note the question of Mr. Epstein's death is just subject to an ongoing and active investigation, has been publicly noted by a separate team of assistant United States attorneys from the Southern District of New York, separate from the team who's handling the prosecution, as well as a separate team of FBI agents. There's an ongoing and active grand jury investigation. It's a function of the grand jury and of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate crimes in the federal court system. It's not the purview, respectfully, of the court to conduct an investigation into uncharged matters. So respectfully, we disagree with defense counsel's suggestion that the court has some authority to conduct an independent investigation. To the extent any other defendants who are detained in the MCC have concerns about the conditions, or believe the conditions are relevant to future or current bail determinations, it is for those defendants and their counsel to raise those arguments, for judges hearing those arguments to evaluate the claims. It's not relevant to today's proceedings. Thank you, Your Honor. In those other cases, Mr. Comey, judges have the authority.
I just wanted to interrupt for a second and say what a TUI request is.
I don't know.
So that is when you ask for testimony or information from a subordinate within an agency. And so there was a Supreme Court case essentially where some guy asked for testimony from an agent, but the agent was a subordinate or wasn't in charge of an investigation. And he was told that he wasn't allowed to provide information because he's just a subordinate. He's not the higher up. And after that case, each department now has different TUI regulations. So it's a way to ask specific people within a department, instead of asking an agency itself for a response, you can ask specific people in the agency. their specific responses.
Cool. I learned something. In those other cases, Mr. Comey, or Mrs. Comey, I keep saying Mr. because I keep thinking of Comey from the FBI. I apologize, I keep getting the gender wrong, but I keep thinking of Comey from the FBI, so I keep saying Mr. I think in those other cases, Miss Comey, judges have the authority to investigate, don't they? Not to investigate, Your Honor, but they have arguments that the conditions of confinement in the MCC as may relate to any bail determination. I think that was the argument that was made. The bigger picture here, Your Honor, is the focus of today's proceedings as we investigate it is to allow the victims that have gathered here to be heard and can comment on the case and comment on the motions that's pending and to bring the case to a close. The court, got it. Mr. Weingarten, may I? The court, sure. Mr. Weingarten, we obviously saw this as perhaps the last opportunity before you. We want to take advantage of the opportunity to say our piece and thank you for allowing us. There's precedent here. Ted Stevens, the senator from Alaska, from the Alaska case in Washington, D.C., Judge Emmett Sullivan ordered an independent investigation by a private lawyer when he was deeply troubled about alleged Brady violations. I represented prosecutors in that case, and so I'm very familiar with it. It is analogous. It is a situation where a tremendous controversy over what happened in the case and whether or not prosecutors went off the reservation. Judge Sullivan, and there were 3 or 4 independent, not independent, DOJ inquiries in the same matter, but Judge Sullivan wanted his own opportunity to make a judgment with the independent investigation. Okay, if I could just add one precedent, Your Honor. The chief judge in the District of Massachusetts, or chief judge at the time, Judge Wolf, in the case called Fleming, were conditions at Walpole, which is a state prisons where federal prisoners were being held, who don't have an MCC in Boston, went to prison, stayed in prison, or determined whether or not complaints made about the conditions were authentic. I think Your Honor has an inherent authority to go to the ninth floor and see how MCC houses is pre-trained detainees. Thank you. The court, are you saying that whether or not the motion before us is granted? Mr. Weinberg, yes, Your Honor. I think, like where appeals are taken, bail issues remain before the district court. Jurisdiction is not completely divested. Your Honor has issued a pre-trial detention order, as Your Honor has the power, the inherent authority. They're not going to refuse you to go look at the ninth floor. They're going to count you to make decisions in the future. I trust the executive branch is not going to prevent the judicial branch from looking into the death of Jeffrey Epstein or the conditions of the secure housing unit at the MCC. Great, thank you. May I, Your Honor? Just briefly, Your Honor, I'd note that upon dismissal of the indictment, which I believe the parties agree is appropriate in the case, there will be no case. There would be no jurisdiction for the court to conduct any sort of inquiry, even if the court had such authority. The court, right. Okay, I think we've heard enough. Me too. So at this point of the hearing, I'd like to call the victims' counsel, plural, for any remarks they may have and may wish to make. Also introduce their clients, those who wish to be heard. It'd be helpful if, in doing that, if counsel, Mr. Edwards, and I see Mr. Boyd as well, I know they're counsel to at least several of the victims. It'd be helpful if whoever's speaking, both Mr. Edwards and Mr. Boyd, would indicate to the court whether or not they've discussed the pending motion with their client, as to say, and the rule of abatement, etc., with them prior to today's hearing. Are we going to hear from Mr. Edwards first? Is that right? Thank you, Your Honor. The court, you bet. It would be helpful, Mr. Edwards, if you state and spell your name for the court reporter. If you're going to introduce someone else, which I trust you are, if you could state and spell their name as well. Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, Brad Edwards with the law firm of Edwin Poddington. I have in the court today 15 victims I have represented over the years. There are at least 20 more that didn't make this hearing for a multitude of reasons. Some out of fear of public exposures, other because in the way the case ended will never bring full justice, and they decided for its best not for them to talk today. Some of my clients are going to address the court that are here today. Others are not. Some of them are going to use the names, and in the past, others have wished to remain anonymous. I instructed each of them to inform the court reporter that they'll be proceeding as Jane Doe so the court reporter can take them down. The court for those who wish to remain anonymous. Mr. Edwards, exactly, Your Honor. And the court, that's satisfactory as far as I'm concerned. Before we do that, I'd like to address a couple of things that have occurred this morning. First of all, whether relevant or not, I, personally on behalf of my clients, do appreciate the presentation Mr. Weingart and Mr. Marty Weinberg made. I have tremendous respect for Mr. Weinberg. I've worked with him through and this relay cases for years, and I understand the reasons why they made the presentation they made. There's 2 things of interest to our clients today. One is because of the tragic ending that none of my clients wanted, nor did I, nor did anyone else. If there's some civil rights violation, there's some civil remedy for Mr. Epstein that goes to his estate. Certainly the victims are interested, as they might help to repair the damages done. Second, Mr. Epstein's untimely death, the timing is curious to us. But more so, it makes it absolutely impossible for the victims to ever get their day in court that they wanted to go into court and to get full justice. That now can never happen. I know Mr. Epstein's has said he wanted it, and no, we did too. A lot of other people here today that are very sad by the way this ended, both for Mr. Epstein and the fact full justice was robbed from them once again. The second issue I wanted to address was Law Review, or the Law Journal article that Your Honor referenced, which is troubling because the opinion seems to say that transparency is not the appropriate in criminal system. It's not appropriate at this point in time. That's tough to swallow, especially in this case, given long history. Personally, I think it's tough. First, to swallow on behalf of my clients, I can say it's very concerning. Transparency is the only way justice system works. We know this because there's similar investigation of Mr. Epstein's many years ago from 2005 to 2008. My personal involvement in the case was because a young female came into my office named Courtney Wild. She came to me not expecting to file a lawsuit against Jeffrey Epstein, but simply asking the government to talk to her. She's cooperating in the FBI investigation, wanted the government to speak with her. I thought it was going to be an easy task. It was only a few months later that we learned the investigation that this was represented by my client in written form, that it'd be a long investigation and to be patient, basically to hang tight. It was resolved by way of a secret deal that never allowed any more than 30 victims who've been identified by Mr. Epstein's abuse in Florida to ever participate in a single hearing. There was a hearing, and they were never notified. I then went on to represent many of them in civil cases and also in extensive pro bono work. And I can tell Your Honor that while Jeffrey Epstein's abuse of them hurt them and harmed them for many years, the feelings was they had aggravated exponentially by the facts they had no rights in the criminal justice system, by the fact they were treated as if they didn't matter. They are not allowed to have their rights under the Victims' Rights Act to be meaningfully conferred with prosecutors, to be treated with fairness, to be treated with dignity. That is what's supposed to be the House about, and to have notice of the hearings. So I do want to thank Your Honor, and especially the prosecutors who have worked for this investigation and in this case, which is very different in the experiences for all my clients and the other Epstein victims in this case, because they are allowed to take part of the process. While some of them elected not to be here today, that opportunity should always be allowed to them. In 2008, we filed the case under the Crime Victims' Rights Act because our client's right was violated, and as Your Honor knows, a federal judge has ruled in our client's favor that their rights were violated. So this hearing today means a lot to them. The fact they may never get a chance to speak in court, they may never get complete closure, and all of them have to wonder if their rights have been afforded them for the first time, would any of us be here now? Wouldn't it be more likely that everyone, including Mr. Epstein, would have turned out better for it? Today, I've not only represented, but have met and become very close with these victims. Many of these survivors, they're very strong people. They are people who have persevered through a lot of adversity. It's been a roller coaster of emotions that led us where we are today. And while we've all cast over the years because of the secrecy of the first investigation and the shadow as victims, you cannot all put them in one bucket and say one size fits all. They're each individuals who have been harmed differently and distinctly, not only through abuse, but the system. On behalf of all of them, I'd like to thank Your Honor with fairness and the way they've been treated, the United States Attorney's Office for the way in which you've handled this investigation, and especially how you've treated the victims in this case. Like I've said, I have many who want to speak, some that can't. This is very difficult for them, but I appreciate the opportunity in investigation. The first client I have is going to be addressing, Your Honor, is the one who walked into my office in 2008, just asking me heard, Courtney Wild. The court, hold on a second. Didn't you all want to be seated? You don't need to be standing. Whatever is more comfortable until you're ready to give some comments. It's up to you. Mr. Wild, if you could, I apologize, Miss Wild, if you could spell your name for the court reporters, please. Courtney, last name Wild. Miss Wild. My name is Courtney Wild, and I am a victim of Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein sexually abused me for years, robbing me of my innocence and mental health. Jeffrey Epstein has done nothing but to manipulate our justice system, where he's never been held accountable for his actions even to this day. Jeffrey Epstein robbed myself and all of the other victims of our day in court to confront him one by one, and for that, he is a coward. I want to thank the United States Attorney for seeking justice that has been long overdue, and most importantly, giving us, the victims, our day to speak, our peace, and to find some closure. I feel very angry and sad that justice has never been done in this case. Thank you. Court, thank you very much. Mr. Edwards, I believe the next client who's going to speak is probably going to be Jane Doe. Yes, Jane Doe. We'll say Jane Doe number one for the record. Jane Doe number one. Okay, thank you for allowing us to speak today. I've shifted with what I've wanted to say in hearing as to what's already been said, and just the question of Jeffrey's death. I don't know what relevance this is to hearing, but I knew it's profoundly relevant to my life as a victim. I don't like that word, but I still feel like I'm learning the ways in which he's impacted me as a complex situation, but he's also a major part of my life. As destructive as that relationship was, as much as a villain as we've created him to be, based on the facts we created him to be a villain, he is a complex villain, and actually all that is irrelevant. Anyone deserves an investigation. It's the right thing to do. Like, we need to know how he died. It feels like a whole new trauma over again, and I don't know why, because I'm just trying to defend myself against him at this point in my life, but still does not feel good. It didn't feel good to wake up that morning and find out he had allegedly committed suicide. Okay, but I also want to say to the press, I'm reading. I read my story in the paper. I've read so many other girls that are similar to my own, and everything that's focused on is not the most important part of it. There was the problem with focusing on these, the facts of the situation. They were out of the ordinary and like because he was such a grand person. It was just a unique situation. I know that's a more interesting side of the story, but I don't want to be used as entertainment. And the fundamental problem of the whole situation is the element of the exploitation and coercion, as these are some things that so many girls can relate to. And even though Jeffrey Epstein brought it to a grand scale on some level, a lot of girls could relate to the trauma we're talking about. And even though this whole situation sucks, I like to think it's possibly a catalyst for change because obviously we've been seeing a lot with the Me Too movement. Change needs to happen, and what I'm seeing in the papers is it's not a common story, but it's so much more common than you realize. Thank you. That's all. The court, thank you very much. Mr.
I just
Edwards,
wanted to interrupt for a second and talk about sex trafficking in the
please do.
U.S. So the girls that actually he has a conviction for sex trafficking and prostitution, all of that. It seems like the MO was for him to find teenagers and then to use them as prostitutes. In the U.S., a lot of sex trafficking is this almost a boyfriend type situation where you have someone who is offering to provide for you. So you might be in a vulnerable situation. You might not have a great relationship with your parents and you want to move out. Well, you're going to need money to do that. Or you're going to want to, move in with a boyfriend. And so when you have someone who is older and rich and saying, I'm going to provide you with opportunities, all you have to do is sleep with me. The way in which girls are victimized, it's not, when we think of sex trafficking, I think sometimes we think of like the movie Taken, where some girl is kidnapped and then prostituted against her will, or held like a sex slave. And although that can happen in the US, a lot of the times it's these Romeo pimps where they get the victim to like them. The victim can feel indebted to this person, and that can create really complex and messy relationships between the victim and the trafficker. Because once they're older and they look back and they go, wow, that was a fucked up situation. Like that should not have happened. I was 14. What was anyone doing? Like, this is not okay. But at the same time, you still have those bonds that were formed because you were sexual with them, because he might have been, their first sexual partner, because he gave them gifts and they might still appreciate the gifts that they received. And it creates this very messy situation. And as complicated as it can be to hear her say that, she didn't want him to die, and there are multiple reasons for that, that ambiguity and that feeling of not knowing how to process the news of his death, like that makes a lot of sense to me. That feels that it's coming from a very true and genuine place, because these situations are messy and you're allowed to have messy feelings about that.
So when you're talking about that Romeo style, is the thing that makes it sex trafficking the way you're using this phrase the fact that it's a minor? Is that what makes that sex trafficking, or is it
Part of
something
it,
else?
yes. Minors, it's automatically considered sex trafficking when the Romeo sugar daddy kind of thing. Most often, see, like if they were in just a dating relationship and there was an exchange of gifts, like, oh yeah, you coming over and you're hanging out and I bought you a necklace. Like that's not prostitution. There has to be a prostitution element where it's like, I will give you X amount of money in order for you to do such and such an act. In sex trafficking, you're often also like you're pimping the girls out to other people as well.
I see. That
So
makes more sense.
yeah, so it wouldn't even just be like there's a 16-year-old that comes over and I ask her to give me a massage. It would also be like, well, my buddy is staying at my, my pedo island. I forget what they actually called it.
Lil St. James.
Yeah. I've got some business friends coming over, and you know what? They really need to be taken care of. They're going to make me a lot of money, so it's important that you take care of them. And so you're, loaning the girl out to you're selling the girl to other people, and often taking a cut of the money that's made through that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but to the girl that's experiencing it, from her limited perspective, in terms of being a teenager, she can also be, at the same time that she's being victimized and sexually abused, she can also be in awe that she's on a private island, or that there's like staff like take care of her.
I have to tell you, I've not spent a lot of quality time on a private island myself, so
Yeah,
I'd be in awe. Just saying.
yeah. And just because she felt in awe, or just, it was like,
well, I can definitely see the complexity of feelings.
by,
I mean, I would imagine putting myself in that position. I would imagine those complexity of feelings. So, yeah, I totally see that. Yeah, I see. Yeah, about the time that you're like pimping them out to your friends and charging fees for services is definitely a point where we've crossed a line somewhere. But yeah, anyways, let's see what Jane Doe number 2 has to say. Jane Doe number 2. Doing okay. I haven't prepared any words to speak today, but there's something that was on my mind this morning when I got here. It's been on my mind reading through the press and through the people I've spoken about, friends, family. Something's bothered me because I think it has a lot to blame in it, and a little blame of what my friend who was up here was speaking about. I think a lot of people ask why we spent so much time, why we stayed. I understand that. An experience that really hard to explain to people who have not gone through it. I think there's a writer, Thomas Nagel, who wrote an essay called What It's Like to Be a Bat. I think that touches it pretty strongly. If you haven't experienced something, it's very hard to fully understand why someone makes decisions they do, what the circumstances were. I don't want to speak for all the victims. I think each of us has a different story and different circumstances for why we stayed in it. But for me, I think he was really strategic in how he approached each of us. Things happened slowly over time. It was almost like putting in the analogy of the frog being put in the pan of water and slowly turning the flame up. You didn't realize it was happening, and I don't think anyone can fully understand the experience, but the blame feels very strong. There's a lot of support as well, but I just want people to try to understand we aren't all bad people. We aren't trying to. It wasn't a situation where we were trying to extort money from someone. A lot of us were very vulnerable situations and in extreme poverty, circumstances where we didn't have anyone by our side to speak on our behalf, and that's really scary. You start to blame yourself because, at first, you don't tell anyone what's happening, and it becomes your deep, dark secret that you try to hide from everyone. I didn't even know I was a victim until I spoke with my lawyers. I had no idea. I had so much self-hatred and doubt and just guilt for everything. I still do. I still don't feel like I deserve to say I'm a victim. And I think that's a big problem with our society right now, that people are still blaming victims. And I think that does need to change. I hope that people understand that each of us has a story, a past, has a family, and to just give us a chance to Basically, that's all I wanted to say. That rings pretty true. That's yeah. Oof.
yeah. Sorry that my internet cut out before.
No problem.
Yeah, so you can see with this continued testimony that slow boil, where it's like first it's a seduction, and then it's like, well, just do this one other thing, and this like that pushing that boundary, pushing that.
Yeah.
Can you go find me another girl? And because then we'll have a friend to play with, but really it's like, go find me another girl that I can prostitute out.
Nah. This is just a general good lesson, also not to get involved with the mob or criminal syndicates in general, because it's basically the same philosophy. Yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, so not recognizing yourself as a victim of sex trafficking is a common starting point for.
I mean, I can't even begin to understand how I feel in this situation. Like, I can resonate. It's like I read what she's saying, and like, I almost understand exactly what she's saying. At least I think I do. I mean, obviously I haven't been in her position, but it's like I can imagine, or I think I can imagine, the panoply of emotions and what she's talking about. It resonates to me in a way that's very understandable, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It speaks very true to me. It's like I can see myself feeling that way.
Absolutely. And even just like to add that whole like you're a teenager on top of everything. So it's like as a teenage girl and you have so many like insecurities and now you have someone who is like someone who's older and cultured and powerful giving you sexual attention, be like, it makes you feel good, but at the same time, but once you start talking to a lawyer, you start talking to police or whatever, and then you realize like, oh, this was all planned. This was all contrived. This was all deliberate. He wasn't in love with you. He wanted to use you and then throw you away once you look too old.
Yeah, and something at least to my mind, it's like the very fact that she's not willing to like call herself a victim, or the very fact that she feels so conflicted, is what makes it feel so much more resonant to me. It feels so much more real, so much more human. It feels just like, there are a lot of times where people in stories sometimes just like up play the victim card, and it doesn't feel real to me. But this feels so much more real because the conflict and the human experience seems so much more real. So it strikes me as a really authentic statement, as opposed to other
Absolutely.
statements I've heard.
And I think that's something that people sometimes struggle with in terms of when someone identifies themselves as a victim of something, that we do this mental interrogation, like, well, if you were in this horrible situation, like, why didn't you walk away? Or why didn't you tell someone? Or whatever. And understanding that sometimes the negative consequences don't come until years later, understanding that they didn't have a place to walk away to, that they didn't have someone to tell them this is not normal, this is not right. It creates these messy situations. And I think we understand, because I might not, I absolutely have never been sex trafficked. But I have been in situations where I thought I was okay in this situation. And then looking back years later, I'm like, whoo, that was bad. Why did I stay that long? Why did I put myself in such a precarious situation? And so I think I understand that conflict, that ambivalence of this isn't straightforward black and white
Yeah,
all the time. And yeah, I can relate to that. I can really relate to that.
yeah. I really like the way she's able to articulate that because the like, why do you stay? And she gives a very satisfactory answer to me. It's like, okay, that makes sense to me. I can resonate with that. It's like, I'm dealing. It's like you walk me through the emotions in a way that I can understand, and so it makes it more real. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense to me now. So yeah, I'm. Anyways, we'll continue with Jane Doe number 3. Jane Doe number 3. Thank you for allowing us to speak today. I came to New York City 15 years ago to pursue a modeling from a small town. I signed on with an agency and was excited to pursue my passion and dreams. Several months later, I met a female who told me about Mr. Epstein. She portrayed him as an amazing man who genuinely cared for people, that he was going to be able to help me in my modeling career. I was excited to meet him after hearing her talk about him. He sounded like an amazing person. An introduction was made at his New York home. It was there that I was sexually assaulted. I left his home after he threw me, basically put money on the table, and I was ashamed. I was embarrassed. This was not the way I was brought up. I couldn't believe this was happening to me. I left, and my world kind of spiraled after that. I stopped going on modeling castings. I gained weight. I became depressed. I only stopped going out with my friends, and only 5 months after I'd been in New York City to pursue my dreams, I left. I left the modeling industry, and I left New York City, and I totally switched career paths. I buried this deep within me, and all this new occurrences that have come up in the media is what brought it back up for me. I feel sickened and sad it took so many years, and God knows how many victims for this finally come out, but I'm thankful it did. I'm just angry that he's not alive anymore to have to pay the price for his actions. So I thank you for your time. Jane Doe number 4. I just have something very short to say. I met Jeffrey Epstein at a very vulnerable place in my life. And whatever the outcome is with everything, I just want to express that we, the victims, will always carry this irreparable damage and pain throughout our lives after this. It's something that will never going to go away. You know, whoever we marry in our life, whatever future we have in our life, it's always going to be something that will always be there for us. I'm very nervous right now. And Jeffrey Epstein, he took away the chance I had at having a future I envisioned for myself as a young girl. I think many of us here today will never fully heal from that pain and the heartache we will continue carrying with us. So I just want to say that. It's something that's irreparable. I can't even use a better word to describe it, so I thank you for hearing us today. Jane Doe number 5. This is a letter I wrote, so it's going to be, Dear Jeffrey, I think you're a mentally disturbed human being. You used your power to make me believe at a young age I could have my dreams of being a model. You paid for your freedom. You violated my rights. You should have to pay for them just as anyone else. You got a plea deal no one would be able to get. You used your money to get out of having to pay the price for your actions. Also, as a victim, I never got to see what the agreement was or why their special treatment got approved. I think you should be in jail for several years in a population and live like everyone else that's mentally disturbed like you. You have paid for yourself to get special treatment when you're in jail. I don't even think you spent a day in jail as a normal human being. The record would support what she's saying. You had investigators come to my house and also went to a friend's house to question them. I'll never be able to get over the overwhelming emotions and embarrassment I experienced from that trauma. I need therapy several times a week and have high stress and anxiety levels. You paid your way to make public think the girls had nothing going on in life for them. You want to try to blame them that they were lower class and there's a problem with the girls. I was from a middle class family and I did well in school. I lived the American girl dream, or the American girl life. I went on family vacations around the world, grew up in a good city, and my parents are still married to this day. Basically, you said that we didn't have anything in our life. I did. It all came down to being told I was making $200 in an hour. Being young, that was a lot of money, and I didn't know any better. Sadly, you're the one with an illness that you should have gone to see a doctor and also had a mentor group for the sickness you have. I'll continue writing my book about that secret life with all newspaper articles of the case, my high school agenda book of official dates. I'm basing that proof that I have deposited cash after leaving Jeffrey's. I still have all the information, articles I've collected over the years. You've mentally and physically traumatized me. I went to therapy and it was the best thing I did for myself. If anyone learns only one thing from this case, I hope it's that money should not allow you to buy your way free. A crime is a crime and a victim is a victim. Thank you. Powerful stuff, man. Your Honor, my next client is Shantae Davis. Miss Davis. I met Jeffrey Epstein through my first massage teacher, a man who took me on as an apprentice to teach me a practice I want to learn while in desperate search to find a cure for the debilitating neurological disorder I have, which manifests itself into violent vomiting attacks, largely triggered by stress. It's called cyclic vomiting syndrome. Tactical, do you know anything about cyclic vomiting syndrome?
Nope.
Okay, carrying on.
But I know what it's like. Before I quit gluten, I threw up at least once a month.
Well, yeah,
But
that's not good.
no. It's why I don't eat anything that's delicious.
Well, at least that once a month, I guess. Well, I guess it's not as delicious coming up as it was eating it.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to break the tension.
It's okay. We can have an injection of humor in this very dark cloud of a thing we're talking about, so that's fine. I was recruited by, how are we saying this woman's name? Ghislaine Maxwell? Miss Maxwell. Upon meeting her, I wouldn't know I was recruited until many years later when I'd read in the headline, Miss Maxwell and Jeffrey took me in. They sent me to school. They gave me a job. They flew me around the world, introducing me to a world I only dreamt of. It made me feel as though I was becoming part of a family, another thing I was desperately searching for. But on my third or fourth time meeting them, they brought me to Jeffrey's Island for the first time. And on my first night there, Sarah Kellen came tapping on my door late at night to inform me Jeffrey was ready for another massage. My instincts told me this didn't feel right, but I got up and followed her to a villa I had not yet seen, Jeffrey and whatever's villa. I began massaging, trying not to let him smell my fear and obvious discomfort, but But before I knew what was happening, he grabbed my wrist and tugged me towards the bed. I tried to pull away, but he was unbuttoning my shorts and pulling my body onto his already naked body faster than I could think. I searched for words, but all I could say was the meek "no, please stop," but this just seemed to excite him more. He continued to rape me, and when he was finished, he hopped off and he went to the shower. I pulled my shorts up and ran as fast as I could back to my own villa, my feet bloodied from the rocks. I cried myself to sleep that night. Yeesh. I spent 2 weeks vomiting, almost to death, in a Los Angeles hospital after that first encounter. Jeffrey's abuse would continue for another 3 years, and I allowed it to continue because I had been taking it my entire life and had been conditioned just to accept it. It took me a long time to come forward, too long maybe, and all it took to bring this man to justice has been robbed by his death. Every day, every week, I spend in the hospital since. I've suffered and he has won. Every job offer that's been offered to me and then retracted because of my connection to this case, I've suffered and he won. I mean, that particularly is just, that's horribly rough. You know, you offer a job to someone and they're the victim of a crime and you don't give them the job. Now, as an employer, I can kind of understand, because just from like the controversy and stuff, you don't want to be attached to it. But man, oh man, Jesus, that's just like penalizing the victim. Just again, that's like, wow. Every relationship I've had to end because of the abuse I've endured from the hands of this man. I've suffered and he has won. Every woman sitting in this room today, and all the women who have yet to come forward and have not yet come forward, and the lives have been ruined by Jeffrey Epstein's sick abuse of young girls. We've all suffered, and he's still winning in death. I refuse to allow this man to win in death. I couldn't fight back when Jeffrey Epstein sexually abused me because I hadn't yet found my voice. Well, I found my voice now, and while Jeffrey may no longer be here to hear it, I will not stop fighting. I will not be silenced anymore. I need him to hear the pain he's caused, what I've gone through because of it. I wrote a 350-page book of all the pain that I've endured at the hands of this man. I really need to hear. His death has robbed me of that justice. Please don't rob us of justice again. Thank you. Jesus, man. I have one more client that's going to speak today, Anacosta de Juro. Miss de Juro. When I was first introduced to Jeffrey Epstein, I was young and full of hope and the foolishness of a teenager. I was idealistic, and I saw the good in people. Jeffrey Epstein manipulated me, coerced me, and sexually abused me. Something I think is very important to communicate is the loss of innocence, trust, and joy is not recoverable. The abuse spanning several years was devaluing beyond measure and affecting my ability to form and maintain healthy relationships, both in my work and personal life. He could not begin to fathom what he took from us, and I say us because I am every girl he did this to, and they're all me. And we stand here together, those that are present and those that aren't. I was a victim, and it's taken me many, many years to stand here and say, yes, it was me. I was a victim, but I will not remain a victim and be silenced one more day. Although I think it's tragic anyone dies before their time, I'm extremely relieved Jeffrey Epstein will not be in a position to hurt any more children or any more women. I'm glad to be part of a group of women who are now bonded forever in the trauma that we've endured at the hands of this man. Your Honor, we have one more client who is not able to be here but send a message through a letter. Her name is Michelle Lacarta. And Brittany Henderson in my office is going to read the letter as instructed. So this is Miss Lacarta. What happened to me occurred many years ago when I was in high school, but it still affects my life. I was told that Jeffrey Epstein was going to be held accountable, but he was not. In fact, the government worked out a secret deal that they didn't tell me about. The case ended without me knowing what was going on, without him being held responsible, without any explanation, without a chance for my voice to be heard. I was treated like I did not matter. Many years later, he was arrested again. The investigators and attorneys representing the United States have been completely different. I'm still mad, concerned, and confused about how he committed suicide and escaped responsibility again, but I know it's not the fault of the judge or the government's attorneys. I was allowed to be part of the process this time. My attorney was able to tell me what was going on at every stage because they kept him informed. Thank you for inviting me. It means more than you could ever know. I was not able to be here this time, but knowing that I was allowed and having a chance to attend this hearing was helpful for me in the healing process. The fact that I mattered this time and other victims mattered is what counts. For that, I'm grateful. Then Mr. Edwards says, Your Honor, finally in 2008, when I filed the case under Crime Victims' Right Act, it wasn't me alone. I had Paul Counsel and Jay Howard. Paul Counsel is here today, and I think, Your Honor, you cite a piece of his opinion from when he was on the bench, and he has some remarks to say. Once again, Your Honor, I really do believe this is a model for how victims should be treated. in the criminal process, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you, the court. I'll be very brief here because I know there are others who want to speak here. I'm Paul Casil, previously served as a federal judge in the District of Utah, currently a law professor where I teach the crime victims' right at the University of Utah College of Law. I just want to take 1 minute to address some suggestion there'd be no need for a hearing this morning. I think having already heard these powerful victims and recognizing how important those statements will be in the trajectory of their lives makes clear Your Honor has followed exactly the right path. Legally, there is one precedent, U.S. v. Henton, a case you cited earlier, that I wrote a decade ago. That's a nice touch. You cited a case I wrote. I like that. And as explained in the opinion, victims have important interest in the criminal justice system that can only be recognized if they're given their day in court. With all due respect to other law professors that have written in the article, I think transparency is one of the overriding objectives of our criminal justice system, and the one substantive action I urge Your Honor to take today is to publish your remarks as a published opinion. That's a good idea. I like that idea very much. The Henson case, to my knowledge, is the only reported decision on this particular issue, even if it's more than decades old, and yet we can see today these problems reoccur today in many other cases. Your remarks today, I think, should be published so many other judges around the country. Yeah, a published decision in a motion to dismiss. It may be the first time ever, but hey, if there was ever an appropriate time, this would be it. I will encourage you to add your remarks to the reference to the Criminal Rights Act. The Criminal Victims' Right Act promises victims the right to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. The process we have seen unfolding this morning is a clear example of how victims can be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. So I know Your Honor is wondering what the appropriate action here. Unfortunately, it seems there are no legal options, but there was a legal option for you to decide to exercise, which will allow these victims to come forward. And if there's been one positive thing about this case, it's your decision to allow these victims to be heard this morning. I encourage you to publish your decision and encourage other judges to follow what is clearly a model for crime victims in this case that should be followed by others down the road. The court. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. I had no idea you would be here when I wrote the remarks, but it's clear from the literature that you are the leading expert formally of the District Court of Utah, I believe, and it's my pleasure to have you here today. That's pretty cool. Mr. Boy.
I just wanted to go back briefly
Sure.
to the last victim that spoke, and something that she brought up in terms of the healing process and how just knowing that she was invited to be there and that, she could have gone if something else hadn't stopped her was important for her. And this is something that we find in PTSD and something that we find in terms of being able to get closure and move on from a situation, is that when people listen to what you have to say and provide validation and, they hear you out and, don't accuse you of lying and, you're you get support essentially, that increases your ability to heal, that severely diminishes your chances of getting PTSD if you are getting support in the hours and days and weeks that follow a trauma. And so for that victim, what I could really hear was that the first time around, she didn't feel validated, she didn't feel heard, she didn't feel important. That her stake in this was completely ignored. And to be fair, traditionally, the system is set up that it's not the victim that brings the charges, it's the DA, right? And so traditionally, it's like sex trafficking, although there's a victim, it's a crime against the state, and the state goes after you. And so she felt very much like inconsequential in that process. Yeah. And the second time around, she didn't feel inconsequential. And I can hear how that has helped her. And that it reminds me sort of there's a difference between law and justice. And I feel like this testimony is really at the crossroads of those two things, where you have the legal standard of like, okay, well, the indictment is going to be dismissed because you can't prosecute a dead person. But at the other hand, it's like you have justice. So how do you provide something for the victim so that they can get healing and move on? which is, kind of the job of the courts, but also kind of like that's not really how it works. So I can feel the evolution happening where the judge wants to provide an opportunity for people to speak because he cares about the concept of justice, even though the specific rules and regulations are going to affect how that justice is carried out.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
Makes total sense. And at least from my side of the aisle, or my side of the perspective, from the lawyer's perspective, these crime victims' rights stuff, in the legal community have been controversial because of the implications. Because we're always concerned about due process. I mean, the other end of the coin that we're always worried about is the due process rights of the accused. And when the state is going after someone to put them in jail or otherwise, that's a massive thing. And so it's like there's been a lot of concern about how these additional aspects may be impacting that in negative ways. But, you very eloquently spell out the interest for allowing this on the other end of the equation, the interest in being heard, the interest in making sure there's an opportunity. So there's a lot of competing values here, and I think little by little, as this has been being developed, that we're trying to strike a balance so there's an opportunity here. And I want the opportunity for any victim to be heard, to be taken seriously. I say that with some deliberation because I mean that quite differently from being believed. I think there's always the interest of the accused, who may very well be innocent in some cases, and so the whole thing is complicated. But what you said about not immediately coming to the conclusion of they're liars and stuff, and taking it seriously and making sure that everyone's interests are protected is part of what justice is. So I appreciate you bringing balance to that end of the equation. Justice is hard. Okay. So now we're on to Mr. Boys. Thank you, Your Honor. David Boys of Boys, Schindler, Flexner. We have with us today 5 victims we represent. There are a number of additional victims that are either unable or unwilling to come forward publicly. It's been an enormously traumatic aspect of their lives, something that, as you've already heard, and we'll hear more today, is something they can never truly escape from. I want to, as prior counsel has, commend the court and counsel for the Department of Justice for consideration, respect, and attention they've paid to the victims. We believe this is not only their right as a matter of human dignity, but we think it's exactly what the law requires and intends. I'll be more blunt than the court has been, or Professor Counsel, about Professor Green's article. This is an article that cites no authority, and I believe there is no authority for his proposition. I entirely respect his right to advocate on behalf of his client, Alan Dershowitz, who's retaining him in connection with litigation we brought against Mr. Dershowitz. But I would have expected that the Law Journal or Professor Green himself would disclose the connection, which I think is a conflict. Alan Dershowitz, for what it's worth, is an attorney in his own rights, as I'm sure most of you know. But regardless of the appropriateness of the disclosure or lack of disclosure, I think the article opposing allowing the victims to have a voice in this proceeding is inconsistent not only with the policy that underlines the Crime Victims' Rights Act and the very statute Mr. Epstein is being prosecuted under, but also ignores the actual language of those statutes and many other statutes, which Congress has made clear the purpose of criminal law is no longer simply to punish the individual defendant, but find some way to try to mitigate the damage that has been done to the victims through restitution and economic mitigation. Yeah, this is also a relatively recent feature of law, whereas Tactical is pointing out it's always been the state, and the state has always been the one that is recovering. But you see, particularly in sex-based crimes and child pornography, where the criminal law is now compensating the victims, or at least attempting to. So he's alluding to that change when he's speaking to that here, and that's an important note. Prosecutors treat these victims as they are victims, and they're human beings. They're entitled to be respected in our society, the needs given to every human being. So I think this is not only commendable, but I think it's what the law requires. In response to the question the court asked, I have discussed this hearing with my clients. I've told them that under the applicable law, the government has no alternative but to move to dismiss the case, and I believe under the applicable law in the circuit, the court has no alternative but to grant the motion. I think the current law is outdated, and the court has suggested in some of its remarks. I think there will come a time when either the appellate court or Congress will make clear, just as possible to continue civil cases against someone after the deceased, it's possible, at least for the purposes of things like restitution, to continue criminal cases, but we're not there now. And unfortunately, in this case, there are other ways, and perhaps even more efficient ways, to vindicate that interest. We greatly appreciate the remarks of the representative of the Department of Justice today, and we too, on behalf of victims, are not going to stop when we walk out of this courtroom. We're going to continue to seek vindication against Mr. Epstein's estate, and in some senses, perhaps even more important, against the people who worked with him and enabled him. And for whatever it's worth from this commentator's opinion, I hope that they get everyone who was instrumental, we'll say, in this. I don't necessarily, I just, it obviously did not end with Mr. Epstein, and I don't know who else was instrumental in this, but yeah. Wow. As you've already heard, and we'll hear more, Mr. Epstein did not act alone. He could not have done what he did on the scope and scale of what he did for as many years as he did without the activities and support and co-conspirators' activities of a number of other key individuals. And those individuals need to bear their share of responsibility, and those people need to have a reckoning as well. My partner, Sig McClawley, who's been working with me for more than 5 years on this case, is going to, with the court's permission, introduce 5 of our clients who will briefly speak. Thank you. Mr. McClawley, thank you, Your Honor. The first victim who would like to speak today is Theresa Helm. Ms. Helm. Thank you, prosecutors and judge and the court. My name is Theresa Helm. I know today that I feel respected and listened to, so I appreciate that. And I have to say that I commend the boldness of the New York prosecutors for pursuing a man that you know, and others, has clearly taken a lot from other people. 17 years ago, I knew him only as Jeffrey. I was recruited and brought to him from California to New York, and that experience lasted for 17 years. It has been a dark corner of my story, my life story, that has been definitely made worse by my own self-shame and then anger for normalizing all the red flags. Yeah, I feel that one. I feel like we're conditioned to do that, and something that needs to change. So I'm here today. I'm coming forward because it's time to bring light to the darkness. It's time to replace darkness with light. And I'm a survivor of this, and I do aim to progress further from being a survivor, I feel I've worked hard, quite hard, to get where I am now, and I'm definitely in a place in my life where I'll no longer cover it up. I'll no longer cover up what needs to be brought into the light. Jeffrey's no longer here, and the woman that helped him are Miss Maxwell. My experience with Miss Maxwell and Sarah Kellen, and they definitely need to be held accountable for helping them, helping themselves, helping one another carry on this huge, almost like a system. So they almost need to be held accountable, all of them. I'd certainly like to see that on behalf of myself and everyone else here. Our next client is Virginia Roberts Guffrey. Miss Guffrey. I'm a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Miss Maxwell in the dark and cruel and criminal acts they committed against me and hundreds of other girls and young women for years and years and years unstopped. Thank you for allowing me to address this court and speak the truth. I commend the prosecutors for the Southern District of New York for the ongoing investigation and its pursuit of justice for us victims. It has given me hope, and I will not let go of that hope. When I was recruited by Miss Maxwell at Mar-a-Lago just before I was 17, I thought I was given a big break, and I was able to reset my life and bring an actual real massage therapist. We'll try not to look too much into the fact that she was recruited at Mar-a-Lago, right? My hopes were quickly dashed, and my dreams were stolen. Jeffrey Epstein is no longer alive, but this is not about how he died. This is about how he lived. He will not have his day in court, but the reckoning of accountability has begun, supported by the voices of these brave and beautiful women in the courtroom today. The reckoning must not end. It must continue. He did not act alone, and we, the victims, know that. We trust the government is listening and that others will be brought to justice. Thank you. Next client will be Sarah Ramson. My name is Sarah Ramson. I'm a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Miss Maxwell's international sex trafficking ring. I'd like to thank the court for the dignity and respect you're showing me here today, as well as other victims. I'd like to acknowledge and extend my gratitude to the prosecutors for the Southern District of New York for pursuing justice on behalf of the victims. Please finish what you've started. I've struggled to find words adequately to say how important your work is to us. For a very long time, Jeffrey gamed the system at every level, and when he realized he couldn't do it any longer, he showed the world what a depraved and cowardly human he is by taking his own life. But we, the victims, are still here, prepared to tell the truth. We all know he did not act alone. We are survivors, and the pursuit of justice should not abate. Our next client is Amy Farmer. Miss Farmer, I had the opportunity to speak at Jeffrey Epstein's bail hearing, and I really appreciate you heard me and listened to me on that day. I am so sorry that others will not have the opportunity to stand before him the way I did. But I am here today to speak on behalf of my sister, Maria Farmer, who could not be here. Jeffrey Epstein, Miss Maxwell, not only assaulted her, but we're hearing from so many of these brave women here today, they stole dreams and her livelihood. She risked her safety in 1996, so many years ago, to report them, to no avail. It is heartbreaking to her and to all these others that this destruction has been wrought since that time. We're deeply disappointed and disturbed by Epstein's death and the fact that it was allowed to happen while he is in the government's custody, and I'm encouraged to hear that there will be a full investigation as how that was allowed to happen. But it's extremely important, as others have said, that he did not act alone. The people that were part of this will be held accountable, and the investigation continues. I believe we have a real problem in this country with perpetrators of sexual abuse and sexual assault being held accountable. There are so many roadblocks to victims being heard, to cases being investigated thoroughly, and then to those cases being prosecuted. And so I think this is a really important signal to send a message to victims out there that people will take you seriously, people will follow through, and even those in power, as unfortunately we've seen, has not often been able to escape that. Even those in power will be held accountable. Our next person is, Majorique Cartoonai, I guess. My name is Majorique Cartoonai. I'm the victim of Jeffrey Epstein and the sophisticated sex trafficking operation he ran, where he alleged he was a financier. I was 20 and previously modeled and was living in West Village. I met a young woman named Irina through a mutual friend. We were friends for a few months. She was an amazing artist, and she liked to party. One day she called me and she asked if I was interested in being a friend of hers. She told me that he wanted to meet and really liked blondes and thought our age and liked to do the same things we did our age, so I agreed. On a sunny, crisp day, we took a train together to the Upper East Side. She then began to talk a little bit about him on the way to the house. I was at the house. I was sexually assaulted both by Irina and Jeffrey Epstein in his mansion. It left me feeling both disgusted and betrayed. As we walked home to the subway afterwards, she continued to tell me about the man who just abused me with her participation. She seemed exhilarated from the horrific experience. I was shocked and in a dazed. This is a few things she had told me. She told me he went to Cooper Union, that he was a mathematical genius. They had favorite girls that he would take to Chanel for a 15-minute all-you-could-buy shopping trips. He told me that his right-hand person had a connection to the arts and fashion world, and he could help me. This is not my complete story. I'll stop here. I'm in a good and stable place in my life, and I've decided to come forward to be a voice to victims who may not be able to tell their story, or at least not yet. I feel like I am a survivor. Thank you, Judge Berman, for inviting victims to speak. We hope the government is listening very closely. Mr. Boys, I'd like to express to the court how proud I am of all these women who have come forward. It's taken an enormous amount of strength and courage for to do so. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Boys. Hold on one second. Miss Lerner, thank you, Your Honor. My name is Kimberly Lerner of Lerner & Lerner, and Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like my client, Jeffrey Arzos, to stand next to me. Sure. Would that be okay? Absolutely. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by saying that I'm in awe of these beautiful women. I just want to let you know that on behalf of Jennifer and myself, we admire you, we respect you, we applaud you. We're all brave survivors, and Jennifer's heart is with you, and we want to thank you for coming forward. Jennifer, when she went public, she thought it was one of the only ones, and to see all these faces I know is amazing for her. Jeffrey Epstein was a predator, a pedophile, and a sick individual. However, he was also a thief. He stole Jennifer's childhood dreams, her innocence, and self-confidence. She was 14 years old. What he could not buy, he forcibly took. Why? Because he surrounded himself with a network of powerful people who not only looked the other way, but also actively facilitated and participated in the sexual abuse of children. Jeffrey Epstein thought he was above the law, and essentially he was until now. The system let Jennifer and the other victims down, but it does not have to end here. We ask the United States Attorney's Office and the FBI to bring all of Epstein's enablers and co-conspirators to justice. It's taken it's taken Jennifer 18 years to find her voice, and again, Jeffrey Epstein has tried to silence her. While she will never have her chance to face him in court, he no longer has any power over her. Today, this brave survivor will be heard. Miss Eras, thank you for allowing me to be able to have my chance in court today, to be able to tell you what this horrific man did in my life. You cannot even imagine how much it affected my childhood, all the way through my adult life. He robbed me of my dreams, robbed me of my chance to pursue a career I always adored. He stole my chance at really feeling love because I was so scared to trust anyone for so many years that I had such severe anxiety. I didn't want to leave my house, let alone my bed. The fact that he felt entitled to take away my innocence, the fact that he felt he could take whatever he wanted, regardless of the laws, hurt me so much. Hurt me years to tell what Epstein did because I was so ashamed and embarrassed at what people would say or think of me until I found out that there were other victims and girls just like me. I knew I could no longer keep my silence no matter how ruthless and powerful Epstein was and still is after his death. The fact that I'll never have a chance to face my predator in court eats away at my soul. Even in death, Epstein is trying to hurt me. I hope to at last get apology. That was not going to happen, I'm sure. But this evil man has no remorse or caring for what he did to anyone. I felt let down by the people that were supposed to watch him in prison, that they let this man kill himself and kill the justice for so many others in the process, taking away our ability to speak. Out of all the damages and side effects Epstein caused by his heartlessness and selfish acts, it's hard to put my feelings and emotions into word. Trying to let his horrendous actions go and attempting to forgive him has been so difficult for me. Yet as hard as it has been to come publicly forward, I refuse to let Epstein take me as a victim anymore. I am a survivor. That people stand before me today have shared this horrific experience with this deplorable human being, because even though this weak, evil coward tried to steal all of our childhoods, tried to steal all of our innocence, and tried to steal all of our means of justice, he will never steal our inner strength and will never, ever steal our voice. It's pretty good. Good morning, Your Honor. Terry Gibbs. For the record, I'm a California attorney. I'm not admitted to the New York State Bar. I'm here to make statements on behalf of New York attorney Lisa Bloom. I work for her firm, the Bloom Law Firm. Lisa Bloom represents 4 of Epstein's victims. Jane Doe 6 for the record, Jane Doe 7 and 8. Okay. I'm so proud of all the victims who are here today and have been able to voice themselves. I cannot comment on the criminal case or Ms. Bloom's communications with her client. Ms. Bloom would like to share 3 of her client's statements for the record. Here are their statements. Statement of Jane Doe number 6. To the Honorable Richmond Behrman, Jeffrey Epstein stole my innocence. He gave a life sense of guilt and shame. I do not consider myself a victim. I see myself as a survivor. The abuse I endured cannot continue. Let's stop before it happens to other women. Jane Doe number 6. Jane Doe number 7. To the Honorable Richard Berman, I wish to use relatively carefree, inquisitive, hopeful, and excited about my life, but my life changed because of Jeffrey Epstein. My perspective on life became very dark when I was unknowingly recruited by one of his agents. Jeffrey Epstein ruined me. His recruiter ruined me. His far-reaching consequences of the day ruined my family's lives. I have chosen to remain anonymous in order to protect my family from unwanted media attention. I was just trying to figure out my path in life when I encountered Jeffrey Epstein in his New York City mansion. I cannot even begin to summarize the many detriments this experience of sexual assault has had on my life. Immediately following the incident, I was unable to function and be around other people. My parents had rescued me and brought me home, where I've been at recluse for years. I was changed forever and buried my assault deep down, where darkness could not hurt me anymore. But of course it has always been here, lingering and hurting me unconsciously. At the time, I was mired in shame, guilt, and humiliation. I had somehow tricked myself into thinking that I had allowed the assault to happen, that I did it to myself, that I didn't deserve to be alive or to be loved. I believed that I was a disgusting, shameful person who did not deserve to ever be happy. These are thoughts I've lived with on a daily basis. Furthermore, because I could not tell anyone out of fear of judgment, blame, or retaliation, keeping this secret completely hindered my ability to uncover why these issues existed for me, which could have led to a path of healing over the years. It is time for those of power to do the right thing. It is time for compassion towards fellow human beings to reign over money, power, and greed. We need to protect our vulnerable to allow them a chance at normal life, and nothing should come in the way of that. I believe for our future generations, including my own children, this case will set a precedent that victims must no longer suffer in silence on our own or be ashamed for coming forward and seeking protection. This case should demonstrate to all that want to harm others there will be a reckoning and will pay dearly for all the harm they inflict on innocent people. Judge Bierman, I thank you for the opportunity from the bottom of my heart for this forum. To all those survivors who came before me, I commend your bravery. There is no way I could have done this without you. Thank you to the public for following the story, for your outrage and your desire for answers, which will hopefully move this case forward so victims can stop having to relive their experiences every day and move on and begin to heal. God bless the victims, their families, the investigators, and the public servants who work so diligently to find those answers. Jane Doe number 8. In the past few weeks, I've had to reflect on my interaction with Jeffrey Epstein. I realized though I had yet to put it all behind me, I am still the victim. I say this because I have come to terms with it in an effort to get truly past the abuse I suffered at the hands of Epstein. Pursuing criminal penalties against him and having the opportunities to address the egregious crimes he committed against me and other young women would have helped my recovery process. This has all come to an abrupt halt when he took his own life. The point of disclosure is lost. I cannot say that I am pleased he committed suicide, but I am at peace knowing he will not be able to hurt anyone else. However, a sad truth remains. I, along with other people, will never have an answer as to why. I'll never have an apology for the wrongdoing. And most importantly, Epstein will not be justly sentenced for his crimes. Now I sit in my home questioning the well-being of girls like myself. In choosing death, Epstein denied everyone justice. Any efforts made to protect Epstein's name and legacy send a message to the victims that he wins and he's untouchable. I understand his case may be dismissed or closed, but this makes me feel as though I and anyone who has felt pride to his hands simply do not matter. I simply ask that you very seriously consider this final decision, because it will undoubtedly affect all other facets of the case, including any future charges brought against the recruiters or third parties of the crime. I do not want the narrative to be those poor girls. I want to send a message to anyone considering engaging in similar acts to think twice beforehand. I want some sort of closure for us, who will relieve these horrible moments when we were assaulted ahead and taken advantage of by Epstein. You have the opportunity to help us seek that closure. I appreciate your time and conclusion, and ask for your continued support in dealing with the case to illustrate we, Epstein's victims, do matter. Let's see, where are we? Okay, we are with Miss Allred. Your Honor, thank you so much for this opportunity afforded by the victims for their voice, because many of them have never spoken before. They never spoke in Florida. They never spoke anywhere. They never told their mother. They never told their father. They never told their family members. This is an opportunity for them to be heard. We thank you for that. Your Honor, for 43 years, my firm has been a leading women's rights practice firm in the United States. We've helped thousands of victims, and I, as an officer of the court and believer in the system, have tried to encourage the victims to have confidence in the system that should provide them access to justice that should help them to assert and vindicate their rights in the court of law. It has been increasingly difficult in this case for me to say to my clients that we should have confidence in the system given what has occurred in this case. Having said that, I am encouraged by the fact that this court essentially, in an unprecedented situation where the defendant is deceased, is still affording these victims an opportunity to be heard. So we thank you for that. It is some encouragement. Your Honor, you also asked do our clients wish to be heard in reference to some of the issues that have been raised this morning, including what should happen. Your Honor, there have been suggestions that this court should investigate the circumstances of the death of Mr. Epstein. I'm not going to repeat the arguments made by counsel, but I would say that if there is any jurisdiction, I know the legal issue that's been previously argued, that it certainly would increase the confidence of my clients. Not just my clients, but victims all over that are some way located in other parts of the world to have the court oversee the investigation. We're encouraged by the sensitivity of the attorneys for the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and the investigation that's going on with a separate team. However, and in the course of the defense conducting its own investigation, but I do think it would be the greatest confidence if the court in some way would be able to oversee the investigation because the court is a neutral party. Although the court certainly has a stake finding out what happened to defendants who are in custody of the federal system and whether they should face prosecutors and charges against them, but are now not clearly because the system has failed. The United States Attorney has admitted that, and before he admitted that, everyone knows the system failed. Failed the victims, failed the courts, and failed everyone. In any event, Your Honor, having seen so many thousands of victims of gender violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault, I've dealt with child sex trafficking, child molesters. I mean, this is a unique case because there are so many victims and so many failures of the system. At this point, what we really need to ask for is not just words. Words have been helpful, but deeds, and that's very important. In addition, let's say, though, through this case, there's a running theme of betrayal of trust. Betrayal of trust of Jeffrey Epstein. Betrayal of trust by the system. Betrayal of trust of the victims who had a right to justice. The Crime Victims Act should not just be words. It should have meaning and should be enforced. In essence, what we're asking, although you may need to, of course, grant this motion to dismiss, I think the court has showed sensitivity to the victims and victims' needs. If there's any way to keep the record open so victims who have not been able to physically present in the courtroom today, not been able to submit the court any lectures, victim impacts, and not been able to secure attorneys or speak to attorneys, I'm still hearing from victims and not been able to meet with yet, because it's just recently and were now contacting me. So if they could submit, at least for the record, their victim impact statements, I think that'd be a very important assistance to them. So that would be at least they know that their sharing is on the record. So in summary, I'd say they're looking forward to the very serious investigation by a United States attorney of who may have conspired in this case. It's very hopeful. We're hoping everyone may have a role to play in criminal prosecution that will submit evidence. This is about power. This is about many having lived in fear. Fear of the rich, the powerful, the famous. Fear of the system will not afford them justice. So fear of not coming forward. And fear, of course, is a weapon that the rich, powerful, famous, and sexual predators use to silence victims. But that is gone for a lot of victims because they refuse to suffer in silence. Finally, it does take courage to speak truth to power. We thank this honorable court for giving these victims a voice. We thank them, even after the death of the defendant, for showing respect to the victims, allowing them dignity, allowing them a voice. We do want truth. We do want justice. We do want accountability, and we want those conspirators to face the justice system. Your Honor, right now we have 2 clients that would like to address the court. Then I have a couple statements of victims who do not wish to address the court. Okay. Let's see. Hello, my name is Talia Davis. I was going to start the statement by saying that I was a victim of Jeffrey Epstein, but that's not the case. I'm still a victim of Jeffrey Epstein. I'm still a victim because the fear of not being heard stopped me from telling my story for so many years. The lingering fear almost stopped me from attending this monumental movement of strength and power. I'm still a victim because I'm fearful for daughters and everyone's daughters. Fearful for their future in this world, where there are predators in power. A world where people can avoid justice if their pockets run deep enough. I'm still a victim because the 17-year-old Talia was manipulated into thinking she had who cared. Someone who wanted...
Okay.
Okay. All right. Looks like I'm green. So I think we're back live. I wish I knew where I dropped off, though. How long have I not been talking? That's what I need to know.
That is a good question. 1 second.
Yeah. Off though. How long have I not been
I just wanted to say while people are sort of catching up, the idea that a predator tries to convince the victim that this is the best thing for them, that they are going to that they're going to benefit from this, that this is like they should really have an older, wiser partner for their first time, or else like it's going to suck. And like I'm now teaching you things. That is pretty standard. It for people who are predatory like that, they basically, you know that what you're doing is not socially acceptable, and you know that it's wrong and that it's illegal, but that threatens your sense of self as a good person, as a good moral person. So you have to tell yourself certain so that you can reconcile the fact that you are doing the socially unacceptable thing, and that you're a good person. So themselves doing a favor for their victims, or this is actually the best way for it to be done, or it's been done like this throughout human history, so whatever. And they do all of these justifications, and they try to convince their victims of those justifications. And sometimes it can work to a certain extent, which creates a lot of mixed feelings.
So it looks like we lost it somewhere middle of Miss Davies, where they were talking about this. So I'll just go back up to the top and just start Miss Davies over again so that we don't miss anything. So if some of this sounds repetitive, sorry, but I want to make sure we don't skip over anything. Anyways. Hello, my name is Talia Davies. I was going to start the statement by saying that I was a victim of Jeffrey Epstein, but that's not the case. I'm still a victim of Jeffrey Epstein. I'm still a victim because of the fear of not being heard stopped me from telling my story for many years. The lingering fear almost stopped me from attending this monumental movement of strength and power. I'm still a victim because I'm fearful for my daughters and everyone's daughters. I'm fearful for their future in this world, where there are predators in power, a world where people can avoid justice if their pockets run deep enough. I'm still a victim because the 17-year-old Talia was manipulated into thinking she had found someone who cared, someone who wanted to help. Jeffrey knew I had nowhere to go. He knew I was vulnerable and took advantage of that poor girl who will never be the same. I cannot eat at the thought of Jeffrey Epstein. I cannot eat at the thought of Jeffrey Epstein not serving the time he needed to realize the pain and suffering he caused many vulnerable young girls. He thought he was untouchable, and so did I. I thought he was the most powerful person I'd ever meet. But the end is here, and I stand becoming more powerful than he will ever be. Thank you. Jane Doe number 9. In 2004, when I was 15 years old, I flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane to Zorro Ranch, where I was sexually molested by him for many hours. What I remember most vividly was him explaining to me how beneficial the experience was for me and how much he was helping me to grow. Yikes. I remember feeling so small and powerless, especially after he positioned me laying on the floor so I was confronting by all the framed photographs on the dresser of him smiling with wealthy photographs and politicians. After he finished with me, he told me to describe in detail how good my first sexual experience felt. That was the first of many lies I was forced to carry on for him, the weight of which proliferated my trauma. I felt powerless, not merely because one man wanted to strip me of my innocence, but because I was the victim of a system that just enfranchises human beings, making them more vulnerable to pedophilic exploitation. As unjust as what happened to me, I believe the experience to be a symptom of the insidious and pathological violence that extreme wealth yields, a violence which ultimately stays hidden through channels of extreme power that serves it. I'm echoing?
I don't hear the echo on Discord.
Yeah, I don't see. I didn't change any audio settings. As unjust as what happened to me, I believe the experience to be a symptom of insidious. Has it been echoing this whole time?
I don't hear the echo on Discord.
Yeah, I don't see. I didn't change any audio settings. Okay, I see what happened. I got it. I fixed it. Thank you. Problem solved. Anyways, as unjust as what happened to me, I believe the experience to be a symptom of the insidious and pathological violence that extreme wealth yields, a violence which ultimately stays hidden through channels of extreme power that serves it. I first identified with a feeling that night after I was molested by Epstein, when another girl and I took 2 of his ATVs and raced them across the mesa. I crashed mine and expressed concern to the other girl of getting in trouble, which she replied to me, "Don't worry, no one gets in trouble for anything here." Even as a child, I understood in a sad and precarious way that what I hope to have the ability of changing now. Even though Epstein is dead, there is still justice to be brought for the crimes that we felt powerless against concealing him and the system that supported him for all these years. Now we're up to Jane Doe number 10. I'd like to read a statement from Jane Doe 10, my client, who is present in court but requested that I read it. We only have one opportunity at childhood, one opportunity to develop, one opportunity to find direction for our lives. Jeffrey Epstein robbed and denied each of us the opportunity we had. I came from a small Texas town not far from the New Mexico border. My mother died when I was 11 after suffering cancer for many years. My father was devastated, as were siblings and I. My father was saddled with debt. My only hope for college was getting a scholarship. When I was 15, I was a blossoming freshman in a high school and were trying to carry on my mother's dream. She wanted me to master the violin. After school, I'd often go to a mall in a nearby city. A lady approached me and saw I had a violin case with me and asked me if I was any good. We talked about the violin, my family's, and why I had clothes that looked like hand-me-downs. The lady told me she works for a very rich man who had a home close by, and they'd like to hear me play. I was told that if I could get away, she could arrange for transportation to and from his place and have me back before anyone knew I was gone. After some hesitation, I agreed. This decision was the beginning of the end of my childhood. The man who identified himself as Jay, or Jeff, had asked if I'd give him a massage, and our 4 visits eventually progressed to forced oral copulation. The money he gave me further placed my young soul in a perverse sense of hell. I was so utterly disgusted with myself and what he did to me that I stopped going to see him. I documented the event with the Texas Rape Crisis Center about the man I knew nothing. Man I now knew as Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein targeted and took advantage of me, a young girl whose mother had recently died in a horrific death, and whose family structure had deteriorated. His actions placed me, a young girl, into a downward spiral to a point where I purchased a gun and drove myself to an isolated place to end my suffering. A voice that could have only been my mother told me, quote, "I am not the victim, I am the victor, and I dare not pull the trigger." I returned the gun days later. Epstein is a coward. He lived his life leeching off the souls of the inspiring young girls due to the fact that he could never know what it feels like to be inspired to live. Like a leech, once Epstein had his fill, he would unlatch and seek out another victim. The only sense of justice I had hoped was seeing him sentenced. However, Epstein died as he lived, taking out the easy way without any responsibility. Your Honor, the next statement is also a statement from Jane Doe. This is Jane Doe number 11. I was a 16-year-old virgin when Jeffrey Epstein first raped me. I was naive and gullible. He's a pillar of finance and giant in a world that I was an insignificant part of. I was so impressed this great man would even talk to me and impart any wisdom on me. I gladly jumped at the chance to meet him again when I told him how impressed he was by my personal story and maturity for my age. When I was in his presence, he made an effort to call celebrities and influential people on speakerphone, like Academy Award-winning actresses and supermodels, who always answered his calls. Sadly, I was impressed. He was friends with former and future heads of state and every other fixture in New York social scene and beyond. He knew important people in my own world that looked up to and revered, but he spoke about them like they were sweet distractions far beneath his stature. He could easily reach down from his position and influence the people directly involved with daily life and future prosperity. I was the perfect victim. My whole life was extremely turbulent, but one of my mother's great wishes was that all children would graduate from respectable universities. He promised me that he'd write me a letter of recommendation for Harvard if I got the grades and score needed for admission. His word was worth a lot, he assured me, as he in the midst of funding and leading Harvard study on the human brain, the president was his friend. As a matter of fact, the president of Harvard was in fact his friend. He wasn't lying about that. The fact that all of you knew about these next details, which I'll share, should ignite a fire instead of induce the complacency that he did in the past, where he repeated over the years, but yes, an instant massage turned sexual almost immediately. Here, come help with me kinking my shoulder while we finish our discussion. A large vibrator and a couple $100, disgust and dirty secret, more praise and imparted wisdom from a godlike figure, a deliberate diabolical expression of grooming and submission for pleasure and release. Even if I resisted, I was no match for him. I felt powerless, ashamed, embarrassed. I want to vomit remembering those moments. What I learned in those depraved sessions, staring up at the dome ceiling of his private massage room, tore a violent hole through any normal sexual awakening. I am haunted forever, having learned everything there is to know about sex through a vile criminal. Wow. Every time a new molestation would bring a new lesson, the progressive and constant unwinding. I was nothing more than a teenage prostitute. I was his slave. I never even kissed a boy before I met him, and never throughout the horrific abuse did Jeffrey Epstein kiss me even once. When he stole my virginity, he washed my entire body compulsively in the shower and told me, "If you're not a virgin, I will kill you." And then I wasn't a virgin anymore. He forcibly penetrated me. I was numb. There was pain, but it was the use of the vibrator and his fingers in the previous sessions had left me with a black hole void between my leg. Oof. I protested, but he forced my face into the bed to stifle my cries. That was my first time. That's a pretty dark picture right there. I got a few $100 as was usual, and he led me out of his mansion with assurances that I was on the right path, guided by him. I lied to myself and tried to believe him. I became a hollow shell. If I missed an appointment, he threatened me and let me know who was in charge. "Do you know how important my time is? I will bury you. I owe this. I won't say the word effing town." He would hang up. I would stand there, frozen in the street, terrified that his assistant would call to reschedule. I made sure to stay in line and not disobey him. I was in complete denial. Being paid after every scheduled meeting felt routine and disgusting. He was master of the universe and the world bent to his will. He would eventually brag to his assistants about my ability to please them sexually right in front of me, letting me feel grotesque and worthless. Everything in my outside life was falling apart. I distanced myself from friends and grew further away from my family. I felt less human after each ordeal. My psyche broke down completely, and he wouldn't let me continue. One day, I walked out of his residence and passed a girl similar to myself. When I turned around, she was entering Jeffrey's residence. He no longer even tried to schedule his appointments with other girls in secrecy from me. Maybe he never did. I was too stupid to see. My world shattered. I had been so naive. I had an epiphany and a cavalry of desperation. I realized I was just one of many young girls he had in rotation coming to perform him for money. I was in deep depression and never lifted completely. I wanted to inflict pain on myself. I was humiliated, angry, suicidal. I had locked away from everything. I cut myself off from the world forever that I had known. I endured the daily agony of knowing my life would never be the same. I could never go back to New York City and this wonderful life I'd taken for granted before I met this demon named Jeffrey Epstein. This creature had manipulated and outwitted the whole system, including some of the most intelligent scientists, political people, prosecutors, and power players. How easy is it to manipulate a 16-year-old virgin who had never had a boyfriend and came from a background of hardship with no parental guidance or support? I went to therapy and was given antidepressants, severe anxiety, and depression. My only solace years later was my desire to succeed on my own terms. I immersed myself into my studies and was accepted at every college I applied to, graduating from a top university. To this day, there's still an ache in my being that I did not apply to Harvard in fear of his influence there. They say you never forget your first. I'm in a never-ending nightmare trying to do just that. Wow. I'm forever suffering because of everything he reminds me of that horror. This new wave of worldwide publicity only worsens my despair. It was only many years later that I was finally intimate with a man again, and those moments were marred by my actions as a child with Jeffrey Epstein. Even now, it's impossible to separate his treachery from any care of good man. Rough. For one brief moment, there was elation when he was recently arrested. I finally get a chance to see him again face to face, and to show him what I've become, that I succeeded on my own, that I was worth something in spite of his abuse. I surmounted the monumental obstacles he laid in front of my entire life since falling prey to him. I had hoped humanity would prevail, but it seems to me he outsmarted everyone so far, and his ghost is still laughing at us. I appeal to all those just and true that his evil legacy and death will not stand in the way of the resolution for this and all underage victims. And then just one this much shorter. Jane Doe, which I believe is number 12, if my count is correct. Jane Doe, number 12. I was a model in another country when I came to the United States. I was told by a booker that I need to meet with a man named Jeffrey Epstein, who is the owner of Victoria's Secret. Well, he wasn't quite the owner, but he did do all the finances for the guy who is the CEO of the parent company, so close enough. The booker told me Mr. Epstein could help me get into Victoria's Secret's world. It was a childhood dream to be a Victoria's Secret model, so I went one day in the afternoon. I met Mr. Epstein in his office in a mansion in New York. A woman introduced herself and suggested to me that I should be extremely nice to Mr. Epstein, because if he liked me, he'd probably have the photographers shooting photos of me right away. They told me to go upstairs and directed me to Jeffrey Epstein's office. Mr. Epstein had a white robe and chatted very briefly. I had a portfolio of photos, but he didn't even look at it. Suddenly, he took his robe off and got close to me. I got to leave, but the door was locked. I didn't even know what was going on. It was my first official meeting to be cast in the United States. I was a young girl and confused. He got very close to me, and I had a skirt on. He started to touch my genitals. I refused him. Then he went to the massage table and showed me a vibrator. I took it and I threw it at him. At this point, I ran the door again and figured out how to get out of there. A girl outside asked me where I was going, and she said to be careful. She said Mr. Epstein knew a lot of powerful people, including Bill Clinton, that if I didn't do what Mr. Epstein wanted, I'd not be able to get a job in the industry. Sadly, that was actually probably true, too. This is just all kinds of messed up. I'm so scared. I couldn't wait to get out of there, and I left. I took the train home. I spent all my savings getting Victoria's Secret lingerie to prepare for what I thought would be my audition. Instead, it felt like casting call for prostitution. It felt like I was in hell. Thank you. The court. Was there anyone else, any victims' counsel, or any other victims who have not been heard and wish to be heard? Well, okay, then all I have to say really is thank all of you for your participation today in a remarkable hearing. I think everyone has benefited greatly from your input, especially the testimony of the victims here today, and have the courage to go forward. We've also benefited from the legal proceedings, however brief together, from the attorney's legal advocacy and their written and oral submissions. I'm grateful to them, both for the government and defense, and for the representing of the victims. Finally, we're also grateful for the press for the very diligent coverage of seemingly every detail of the case. That concludes our case for today, and we're adjourned. Thanks. So that is the end of the transcript from yesterday. To the best of my knowledge, I do not believe the case has been formally dismissed. So maybe the court is taking the invitation to write a formal opinion and a motion to dismiss, and we'll see something later. So Tactical, do you have any closing thoughts as we wrap this thing up?
Just that the victim statements all make a lot of sense to me. There are other people in the U.S. who are doing similar things, and we don't know their names because they aren't rich. And I think that the victims in those circumstances would probably have very similar things to say. And you can see the manipulation that was going on, in which he's trying to convince the girls that he's doing them a favor by assaulting them. And when he doesn't get his way, though, he's very quick to say, you'll love it when I love you, but you really don't want to know what it's like for me to not like you.
No.
And it really sounds like there was just a parade of girls in his life, that this was his lifestyle, was to find and assault these girls. And I am hoping that the conspiracy, because Jeffrey Epstein had conspiracy charges against him, and you need a second person in order for there to be a conspiracy charge. So I'm really hoping that the co-conspirators will be charged, and maybe the victims can get some sort of justice that way as well, because he didn't do this alone.
I think the thing that makes this particularly offensive to me is the mechanized, systematic, organized nature of it all. It's like the same way, to my mind, the Holocaust is different than other tragedies. What makes the Holocaust particularly notable is its sort of mechanized, organized, just sort of brutal efficiency is what makes it notable. And that's like how I feel about this case too. Because you see all these people, we've read the prior cases with his island, his house in New York, his place in France, the one in New Mexico. We saw the amazing deal we got him. He was sentenced to a year, but by a year we mean that 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, he wasn't in jail because he was on work release in this amazing deal with writing that potentially insulates him for other things and his co-conspirators. It's like, it's just the sort of like the mechanized nature of it, and how, and the conspiracy. It's like, yeah, it's private secretaries, and like how many people knew, and how many people had to be involved, and how people had to be like assisting him and protecting him. And the other thing that sort of just like note that I was taking note of is like these girls who were saying like they were suicidal. It's like, I can't help thinking to myself, it's like, well, how many girls were suicidal and actually committed suicide? How many fatalities are there as a result of this guy? Because I'm betting the number's not zero. And it's just like, every act of child pedophilia and sex trafficking is bad. But it's just like, it's so, if you just think about like even like Jared Fogle and like, how bad that case was with the underage, child pornography. This case is like magnitudes worse in my mind. It's just so, I mean, you correctly point out that he's not the only person who's like this. So he's not the only person who's doing stuff like this. But he's doing it on a scale that I have a tough time believing that there's anyone else doing it on the scale. It's just so massive. And that's the thing that like really brings me to this story. It's just how, and it was going on for so long. It's going for decades that all these people knew, and how many people were involved. It's just, it's mind numbing. And I'm not blaming the girls. I understand. They all thought they were alone. They were all like, I'm not blaming them in any way for not coming forward. I'm blaming everyone who he was hiring and conspiring with. I'm blaming all them. They all knew better. They all knew what was going down. And like none of these adults were interjecting at any point. That's like where my outrage and feelings go towards. It's like, I don't blame these girls for their conflicted feelings, for feeling alone, for not coming forward, for a whole bunch of things. I'm blaming all the adults. I'm blaming the people who went on for years and with this knowledge of this massive sex trafficking enterprise. Because what other word is it for that? That's just like, the scale of it is what's so horrible to me. It's, beyond the pale. Well, that will conclude our stream for tonight. I doubt it will conclude our Jeffrey Epstein coverage because I'm imagining the court is going to issue a decision. I hope they will, at least. And if they do, God knows we're going to read that. And this will probably spurn into other things. And if we ever get a copy of the autopsy, we're going to read that. And we'll see what else happens. And, I don't know the truth of how Jeffrey Epstein died. No one does. But the whole thing strikes me as so suspicious. It's like, just amazing to me, at least. I mean, because, again, as I mentioned in a prior video, there hadn't been a suicide in this particular prison in 21 years. And they're like, their most high-profile prisoner is the one who finally manages to pull it off. It's like, okay, I guess. It's just, like, amazing to me. But we will have more later. Thank you for your time and attention. I thought this was really, really important. I thought these people had a right to be heard, and I thought it was important that you had a right to hear them. And so we read everything as best as I could. It took us 2.5 hours, but I think it was worth it. Till later, my friends. I hope this has been somewhat enjoyable, at least informative. Till later, my friends. Cheers and goodbye.